to our group. And we, the platform of studies on oil and gas organizations comprises a dynamic international community of scholars from Brazil, the US, India, and other locations, and comprised of economists, psychologists, lawyers, sociologists, political scientists, international development planners, and others, all brought together by the interest that we share in industry studies and public administration, policy, and economic development. And how do you put this together? And the team comprises of students, PhDs, master students, PhD students, researchers, practitioners, visiting research scholars, and exchange students. We have a collaboration. It's an EBAPE, MIT. It started as a project, a research product with the Professor Alice Amsden from the Urban Studies and Planning Department at MIT, an economist that passed in the 2 years ago. And the first initial idea was to study the role of the state and its intervention in economic development, particularly through the eyes of the looking at the industry, the oil and gas industry, and its geopolitical configuration, and the role, the one particularly in Brazil. And then it was eventually to be expanded to look the study of other countries and also to other industries. But initially it was through this industry, our core initiative. Eventually, with time, we expanded and invited some other researchers, and we had recently, like 1 year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we started a collaboration with the TC Lab, the Technology Change Lab at the Columbia University, with Professor Smita Snirivas, an intensive collaboration that to some extent changed or kind of focused more the mission and the vision of the group in terms of studying not only the broad aspects of public administration development, but focus more in the industry and its more decentralized industrial governance. So the institutions, the actors, the partners, and how it's organized at the local and central level, and the relationships between these two among the local and central. Well, this is for us, for our group, it's a conference is a very important milestone in terms of in-depth research efforts from many theses, dissertations, and faculty involvements. I have to say that our studies range from we have organized in our group. We have organized our studies in around the micro, meso, and macro level, and so more around the individual in the industry and trying to understand how it behaves, or how the individual, what is the problems, the obstacles, the features, the profile, the incentives that the individual has in the industry, and the performance and its relationships. At the meso level, we have some students and researchers and professors looking at the organizational aspects of the industries. So, and how it's organized, how also technology happens, innovation. And at the macro level, look at more this fiscal and economic aspects and political, public policy and political aspects that affect and are affected by the industry. So it's a milestone because after 4 years, the first time that you are able to gather, first of all, a cadre of people from international community here in Brazil, and that our studies and our observations and our participants, members can gather together, inviting people from in the industry, from the academic community, and from other groups that are interested in discussing the issues, the diverse and multidisciplinary issues that affect the industry. So, and then it's important also because not only of the in-depth research efforts, but also because it brings together then this range of a large range of industry experts from private and public sector, from consortium of the industry, multilateral organizations, development agencies, and government itself. And I hope everybody will be here because, we have had many casualties coming. We will have, I will start introducing some of the members of the group. And Professor Smita Nerivas, who is now in India, hearing us, listening to us through Skype, and she'll be all day long. She will have a few words. She was supposed to be here. We had some bureaucratic problems, and that's why she's not. It was a huge frustration for us, but she sent us some voice greetings and comments on the group. It is a short one. It's not too long, so we are going to pass some slides, and then her voice will be in the background. And later on, then I'll start with the first panel. So if we now may, we can start the voice. Is that okay? Okay, so let's start. This is Professor Smita. She is the co-principal investigator in this endeavor. She's the director, still the director of technological and change lab, and head of the School of Economic Development in the Indian Institute for Human Settlements.
Good morning, everyone. The timing is excellent of today's conference in the wake of the COP21 meetings. I want to welcome you all, and on behalf also of Professor Monica Piñanez. As you know, we are both principal investigators on a research grant on decentralized industrial governance, jointly awarded through the Faperj, Rio government, and the Columbia University Global Centers. We're very grateful to the Rio government, and especially to Tom Trebat and his team for the support, and to FGV at a critical stage for our research team. These funders were able to see the long-term implications of this work, and I think the importance of building an internationally collaborative team. In welcoming you, I want to keep in mind the time constraint, so I have 3 very quick slides. It is clear, to put this in context, the deliberations we have today, that not only is there an immense shift underway in the world of energy, and certainly in the oil and gas sectors, but how we think of the relationships of these separate sectors internally and to the broader questions of development are very different. Industry studies scholarship, as well as its connections to public policy and administrative guidelines and clear-cut suggestions, are very critical today in new ways. These affect how we make sense of the scale and scope of the sectors, the types of innovations, and new industrial governance mechanisms. It's this last point that I will come back to in much more detail. My comments are framed, drawing from past research and the work ongoing with the Brazilian team. Let's remind ourselves this morning of certain facts. The public sector story in Brazil, in the oil and gas sectors, was remarkably successful in many respects. Petrobras was a public-private hybrid with public goals. Private sector management practices combined with a national, state-driven developmental mission, and this has proven itself very successful, particularly as it was complemented in multiple ways by new organizational innovations in order to provide developmental outcomes. Technologically, it was innovative in order to address geological challenges and the economic urgency of oil in a situation of relative scarcity. Its public mission and organizational strategies are noteworthy, and the current scandal notwithstanding, there are critical insights to take from this context into the wider domain of developmental goals and how to reach them, and the role of public administrative and planning capacity. The book shown here is a book that takes on these questions of industrial governance very seriously and embeds the public administrative challenge within the broader context of production and development goals. Production, after all, is only one facet, a crucial facet, though it may be, in late industrial states, and Brazil and the Petrobras example show us some of the past and future challenges. So building on this book, I want to address a couple of quick issues. As in many sectors and nations, the specific role over many decades in this sector require new policy and planning instruments. As we have seen also from the new political questions about Petrobras, there are also new types of legitimacy and credibility issues on the exploration and production side, and increasingly new types of institutional arrangements necessary to deal with demand and delivery. Let me touch on these briefly. Starting with the National Oil Council in 1939, and to remind you of the context, the state-led effort in technological and organizational capability recreated the Brazilian oil and gas sector into a vital one, not just for the nation, but the entire world. In addition, dramatic new changes in market restructuring and new regulators came into being, most notably a constitutional amendment in 1995, which ended Petrobras' legal monopoly. Furthermore, the National Oil Agency was created to become the new regulator, an auctioning system created, and then a concession contract system to allow in new firms with hydrocarbon exploration rights, but leaving oil refining controls and much of oil and gas production markets in the hands of Petrobras. In 2010, further legal shifts occurred, creating a production sharing contract system for the pre-salt polygon, giving Petrobras status as operator of oil fields, and also, importantly, created new minima for participation financially, in terms of investments, that is. It created new public sector firms in the areas oil exploration and production, and importantly for us, and in terms of development, it created high thresholds to local content requirements set up to boost Brazilian industry. These are elements on the production side of the story, one we know fairly well but need to research much further. However, there are other crucial challenges facing the sector, as we well know looking at COP21. We also know that for these sectors in Brazil and around the world, domestic political criteria and the ability of public organizations to experiment requires more thought. They are coming under greater scrutiny, and this is especially true in those developing contexts where technological capabilities have become quite sophisticated. The irony of these more sophisticated technological capabilities, as my book Market Menagerie argues, is that they create new political tensions and convergence points, but also points of new political tensions. The book Market Menagerie argued for a different way of assessing success and improvements, and the demands on technological capabilities and new horizons for planning that are required. The book argued that markets not only are various, there's no single one market that we're talking about, no one mythical market, but also that markets exist not just in variety, but in scale. These questions bring us to the issue of decentralized industrial governance, which is proving very crucial as the oil and gas industries have to contend with decentralized production and consumption. In several sectors of essential basic needs and human concerns, such as health and energy, therefore a new equation must be considered that has dramatic implications for understanding public policy and the regulation of economic development and markets. First, in this slide, we see that there are three separate domains: production, which requires the long, hard slog of building capabilities, and we know this to have been a relatively successful story, in some cases dramatically successful story in Brazil. Second, the question of consumption or demand, and new instruments and organizations are evolving all the time. Third, the domain of delivery, which for energy is turning into quite a complex endeavor with all kinds of new market and non-market instruments required. The important point about this institutional triad is these three separate domains co-evolve. Let me make some observations here. First, this production, demand, and delivery form a crucial triad of institutions which co-evolve. A nation with many firms that produces well may still have an abysmal record on attending to demand or delivery. Similarly, countries that have high demand but cannot produce sufficiently face similar challenges. Second, Market failure in such essential sectors is a very poor economic guide for both policy as well as theory. It also proves a very poor guide of understanding what regional governments must do. After all, technological advances are fragmenting not simply the production, but making the questions of certain locations more important, and also signaling that certain types of products and process markets need to be tracked and monitored more systematically. Third, not only do we have various markets with these three domains, we also have new market scales. Decentralization is an important part of this shift, requiring new attention to administrative decentralization, political economy, and fiscal autonomy. As you can see from this slide, as in most industrial sectors, but particularly important in health and energy, there are three essential elements that co-evolve. It is unhelpful to think along linear or vertical supply chains when in fact the institutional arenas for production, demand, and delivery are quite overlapping from the standpoint of public administration and the ability of the public sector to address conflict and cooperation. Furthermore, even in production, as we will see, and unlike in traditional manufacturing sectors, the oil and gas industries have a complex mix in upstream and downstream production and logistics, which closely connect production to delivery. That is, in the oil and gas sectors, production, number one here, is closely connected to number three. And of course, these are shaped by how we imagine the consumption or demand politics to evolve. All exploration rounds, if you recall, held in Brazil since 1997, have established a minimum percentage of investment that is to be located in Brazil. The program to increase the local content is quite successful and is able to have long-term planning horizons. It also works with strong training and finance organizations and expands the types of oil and gas projects all the while facing new demand criteria at local levels. Let us dwell for a second on criteria number 2 in the domain of demand or consumption, because these require attending directly to low-income, underserved urban communities, for example, to energy-hungry businesses, and to city or regionally administered utilities that serve multiple energy needs. Much of the oil and gas exploration and production areas are near the shore. Their geology has shaped the geography of development with important questions for regional administration and for planning mechanisms to ensure that production, demand, and delivery are connected. Let me end here with this triad to suggest this as we look at the panels today on sustainable development, on national priorities, on professional organizations and identities of state and other employees, that we begin scrutinizing some of these issues about the time horizon for planning and the evolutionary co-evolving landscape which connects the triad of production, demand, and delivery. These are developmental concerns beyond any single domain, and there is much for us to do. Welcome to all of you again, and I look forward to meeting all of you in the coming months as our project on decentralized industrial governance builds out further, and we begin some cross-country contrasts to benefit Brazil and the international development community. I am very fortunate to be
Okay, well, so now we continue then, and we then start with the first panel on professional identities in the oil and gas sector. Well, in this panel, one of the topic that we intend to address is how does a hybrid enterprise such as Petrobras managed its human capital in such a context and growth and change, and with a mandate for development. We seek in this panel to understand the professional identity of the sector, as well as what motivates people to enter the sector and to remain in it. Ultimately, people in the sector were responsible for making the company one of the greatest in the world, and they act as the engine for Brazil's position among the world's biggest oil companies. Understanding how these people are trained, qualified, and developed for the industry, as well as what motivates them to join and remain in the sector, can help us understand the relations of the process of managing human capital alongside and perhaps for national economic development. So I would like to welcome to our table Professor Michael Piori. Professor Michael Piori is currently the David Skinner Professor of Political Economy, Emeritus at MIT. He earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees at Harvard University, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation under John Dunlop. And he has been one of the faculty of the Department of Economics at MIT since 1966 and currently holds a joint appointment with the Department of Political Science. I had the honor to study under his guidance and to learn with him many things while I was there. And it's a really, really great pleasure to have him here. But then I will continue with his credentials. He's a director of the MIT Mexico program and faculty co-chair of the Industrial Performance Center and affiliated with the Center for International Studies. He's also the past president of the Society for Advancement of Social Economics. His current research focuses on the management of street-level, centralized bureaucracies in the public sector, and industrial problems. In this study on centralized bureaucracy, he looks at how line agents have considerable autonomy of action. He's also looking at other areas like labor market and workplace regulation, and where he has been comparing the management of the US systems with the system that is prevalent in the Southern Europe and Latin America. Currently, he has also been working on new forms of labor market regulation in the US, as a response to a shift in the axis of social and political mobilization from economic class and social identities associated with race, sex, ethnicity, age, and disability. I could go on, I think, for the whole day with your credentials, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome. And shall I invite the other panelists? And I will also would like to invite Mrs. Adilia de Assis. She's the manager of professional capacitation of in the oil and gas industry since 2011. Her work, she works with the articulation of many agencies, governmental agencies, institutions of middle level and the S system, and universities and the federations of industries. She has worked on the development projects for suppliers in partnership with SEBRAE and in different localities with 70 micro entrepreneurs and projects qualification in conjunction with suppliers, the industry suppliers. She also participated in the elaboration and implementation of the project for the professionalization of almost 1,000 students in the public schools to feed into the industry. She's, thank you very much for coming. She's currently at PROMIP, and we will later on listen to you. Thank you very much. So Michael, please, the floor is all yours, and welcome.
Well, thank you. It's pleasure to be here, and in many ways an honor to be asked to speak. It's also difficult to speak first. I'm glad that Schmidt, even though she's at a distance,
Yes.
sort of broke the ice.
Yes.
Monica asked the title of this session is Professional Identity and the Oil and Gas Industry. And I'm only going to speak to the first half, professional identity,
Okay.
and leave the oil and gas part to my colleagues here, because my background in oil and gas is highly dependent on what I'm learning here in this conference. My concern with professional identity really grows out of, first of all, work early in my career on labor markets, but more recently on studies we've been doing trying to understand public service and what motivates and directs public employees. And we've been focused on an area of public employees which is rather distant, or at least on the surface is rather distant from oil and gas, which is work regulation and more broadly regulation in general. But I think that many of the insights should be useful more generally in understanding the way institutions operate in general. Our focus on professional identity, however, has emerged out of an attempt to break out of an intellectual framework well, I want to use the term public sector management, but I think that really one could speak of management in general, where current thinking has been dominated very much by economics. And economics leaves us with two ways really of understanding or of controlling behavior, one of which is through incentives, monetary incentives, and the other is through bureaucratic regulation. And what we've been trying to understand is what other kinds of motivating factors there are that direct behavior. And in doing so, we've turned to other disciplines, sociology in particular, and anthropology, and to a movement away from the focus in economics, which is on individual behavior and the notion that what is characteristic of human behavior is rationality, and move towards a social conception of behavior, which emphasizes not the individual, but social groups, and emphasizes, to stress a point which I made yesterday in the small working group sessions, that what is characteristic of human beings is language and the ability to speak. So the need, I think, for this an enlarged conception of human motivation is suggested by and here I stray into a territory which I don't know well, but by the corruption scandals in Petrobras. So for economics, okay, economics expects corruption. And the interest of looking at corruption in Petrobras, however, even from an economic point of view, is not why there's corruption, but why there isn't more corruption. So the focus is not on the people who are corrupt, which is what economic behavior expects in an environment in which there's lots of money to be made, but why there's, what about the parts that aren't corrupt or that are directed and motivated by other kinds of concerns? So how do we understand that? And it's in that context that we turn towards sociology and anthropology. So let me just talk a little bit about the framework which those disciplines suggest. They suggest, first of all, that individuals exist in social settings, and that there is a kind of innate tendency among individuals who work together over time around a common set of issues or problems. There's an innate tendency for those individuals to coalesce into cohesive social groups. The second element is that those cohesive social groups tend to generate a set of standards and rules or criteria which govern the behavior of their members. How exactly one understands those rules is something which we're struggling with but we tend to think of those rules as less like bureaucratic rules, constraints which tell you what to do under particular circumstances, but something which is more flexible, which is more general, like the rules which govern the way one speaks a language. Okay, so you have a coalition of individuals into social groups. The social groups generate a set of standards and a means of evaluating individual conformity with those standards, tests, if you will. Okay, and then individuals within the group adhere to those standards. And they adhere to those standards because they value their own sense of self-conception, their identity, so to speak. And here we come to the question of identity, is bound up with adherence to those rules, and their self-respect is dependent on the degree to which they adhere to those rules and excel in their application, and at the same time, the judgment of their colleagues who they come to into contact with every day, the judgment of their colleagues about the worth of the any member of the group is dependent on those rules and the way in which they respect those rules. And it's in that way that the rules come to govern the adherence to the rules and attempt to adhere to them come to govern their behavior in the same way that in economics theory and in fact in the world, incentives sometimes govern people's behavior. And in the same way, similarly, that bureaucratic rules govern behavior. But then the next point, I think, which is important, is that the rules are dynamic. They evolve over time, and they evolve through the way in which the group encounters new problems and new situations. Okay. And then the final point, which I think which is central, is that it's very difficult to direct those rules. Okay, it's not like a bureaucratic system where you lay down the rules and people conform to them. There's something much more subtle involved in the way in which those rules govern behavior. But on the other hand, you can manage the evolution of these identity groups, okay? And then the question comes, how do you manage those groups, okay? So the instruments of management are basically fivefold. First of all, management controls. That is, people come into these groups with a set of outside values. And as they encounter the standards within the group, their own standards change, and as they move into the group, but the group standards also are affected by the values of new members. So what management controls is the recruitment and selection of individuals. So where you recruit individuals, how you select them determines what values people bring from the outside and how those values might influence the evolution of group standards. So that's the first, or this first and second, recruitment and selection of the way in which you can influence these social groups. The second or third element is in training and socialization. So people who enter into new organizations generally go through a period of training. Management controls the content of the training, but often that training is through apprenticeship with experienced people. That's particularly true in the regulatory agencies that we've been studying. They send out their investigators or regulators in teams that often consist of an old experienced employee and a new employee. And when you do that, the standards prevailing in the profession have a much greater influence on the new employees than when management directly controls the training from the and you have formal training classes. But on the other hand, it's very hard to produce in the classroom the kinds of things that you encounter in the operating world. So the system of training and socialization or apprenticeship becomes critical to the evolution. And then finally, well, I guess there are two other critical points here. The standards which people use evolve through the way in which they encounter new situations and new problems. So if you go into an agency like the ones we've been studying, like the regulation of work, and the inspector goes out and he or she encounters a problem that doesn't really clearly fit within the existing repertoire of problems they've encountered, they come back and they discuss with their colleagues what they've seen. Or sometimes you talk, people just have war stories, which they tell after work about unusual cases. They go out for a drink in the evening, they talk about what kinds of situations have occurred, and it's through those conversations or discussions that the criteria through which you are judging the situation change and evolve over time. So there's a constant conversation going on within the work group, and in that conversation, the standards are changing. And the question is, because the conversation is so critical to the way in which standards evolve, can management enter into that conversation and direct it? Can management organize the conversation? Can you get the members of the group to come to regular meetings which management conducts, and where the new cases that come on the table are not discussed kind of informally in the background, but in a process in which the management can exercise some control over the direction of the conversation and the way it arises, and management can bring new cases, new situations to the fore and to the work group. So in terms of the evolution, the flexibility of these standards, the flexibility which distinguishes this form of control from inflexible bureaucratic control, this conversation is critical. And then finally, the other element that is important to understand and model is multiple identities, and the degree to which people participate in different social groups, or they see themselves, or the social group that really is their point of reference span several institutions. And that in part depends on how closed or open the group that you're focusing on is. Okay, so you take at one extreme something like the military or the police. Okay, and the military is probably an extreme case of military officers who go to their education is in a military academy. Then, at least in the United States and in a number of other countries, when they graduate from school, they go into an environment in which the military provides separate housing, separate medical care, separate educational facilities for their children, and the military live in a kind of closed environment. So there's very little outside influence which directs the way in which their view of the world changes and evolves over time. On the other hand, you have people who have very weak commitments to their professional identity, who see themselves, or in regulation, people see themselves as moving from the regulatory agency into working in the industry which they're attempting to control. So one way of looking at that is corruption. Another way of looking at it is the group that we're talking about span several institutions, and the regulatory ethos is kind of diluted by a commitment to the standards that are generated in the industry. Or people go through a number of different evolutions. Or to take it still another example, that was a very nice study at MIT of the changes in the medical profession and the attempt to change procedures in the profession of surgeons. And in that study, women played a critical role. That is, when women came into the medical profession, they brought with them a set of commitments to their role in the family, which were diluted their commitments to their professional identity, and led to changes in the professional standards away from very long hours and from kind of trials by how long you could stay awake at night. And the bureaucratic effort to change those rules for health and safety reasons was a failure. You couldn't do it by dictation, but several years later, when large numbers of women with family commitments entered into the profession, those standards of work standards began to change. So in sum, then, what you're looking at is trying to develop a series of instruments that are and ways of looking at work processes that draw on the social nature of human beings and the way in which these groups operate and function over time, that play upon social identity to move away from the kind of restricted policy instruments that are generated by economics or classic bureaucratic theory. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. That's very enticing, and I think we are going to see the applications of this in the oil and gas industry later on, discuss a little bit. But right now, I'll pass to Adelia, and then you have these slides, right? It's okay? So please, welcome.
Sim, obrigada. Bom dia a todos. Gostaria de agradecer o convite da professora Mônica, professor Michael. Bem, um prazer estar dividindo esse painel com vocês. Tem uma apresentação que eu vou fazer sobre tentar... Isso, obrigada. Para cá? Tá. tentar passar algumas informações, peguei algumas informações, alguns dados para dividir com vocês, e vou complementar minha apresentação com um pouco da minha experiência, né? Eu tenho 15 anos de experiência na área de recursos humanos, na Petrobras, trabalhei nas áreas de RH corporativo, trabalhei na universidade corporativa da Petrobras, e desde 2011 eu trabalho para a indústria, eu trabalho para fora, eu trabalho com as empresas de petróleo e gás, na parte de capacitação. Então, eu vou tentar aqui falar um pouquinho dessa identidade do trabalhador de petróleo e gás, ok? Vamos lá.
Onde?
Aqui, sim. Bom, a primeira questão que se coloca é a indústria de petróleo e gás, ela não é homogênea no seu capital humano, né? A gente, lá no Promimp, eu vou falar depois um pouquinho o que é o Promimp, lá no final da apresentação. A indústria de petróleo e gás, lá, como a gente concebe no Promimp, ela tem, no mínimo, 4 níveis, né? O primeiro nível da cadeia é formado pelos operadores de petróleo, né? É o primeiro elo, são as grandes empresas que administram os projetos, né? São as operadoras, basicamente. Hoje nós temos aí cerca de 26 operadoras no Brasil, segundo dados da ANP. O segundo nível são as empresas, as grandes construtoras que fornecem para essas operadoras, é o primeiro elo da contratação, né? Foram todas essas empresas aí, por exemplo, Odebrecht, né? Essas empresas que estavam fornecendo, né, estão nesse segundo nível. O terceiro nível, né, essas empresas são chamadas EPCistas, né, sistemistas. O terceiro nível são as subfornecedoras dessas empresas, né, que são empresas dos mais variados tipos, manutenção, né, elétrica, são um escopo muito grande de empresas de máquinas e equipamentos, né, que essas fornecem para os sistemistas, os EPCistas, que fazem a integração da operação. E no quarto nível, você ainda tem, por exemplo, empresas de hotelaria, por exemplo, na parte offshore, são empresas que fornecem a mão de obra para trabalhar nas plataformas, né? Vão fazer serviços de hotelaria, cozinheiro, né? Então, você tem ali atividades gerais, oficinas, você tem até serviços de táxi aéreo, né? Helicóptero, né? Frota, logística. Então, assim, você tem também aí os centros de pesquisa e desenvolvimento, né? As empresas, né? Os centros de pesquisa, né? O Parque Tecnológico, aqui é um exemplo no Rio, né? Então, assim, isso tudo é considerado indústria de petróleo e gás, né? A gente hoje não tem uma sistemática, assim, até uma coisa, a gente não tem hoje, por exemplo, como calcular o número de empregos nessa cadeia, né? A gente não tem essa estatística por conta disso, a gente não tem aí um CNAE, né, que identifique petróleo e gás. E eu esqueci de falar da indústria naval, né, que é cerca aí de 78, né, antes da crise aqui, 78 mil pessoas na indústria naval brasileira. Então, a indústria naval, marinha também, se você for considerar, que é importantíssimo, né? Força Armada. Então, tudo isso se relaciona com a indústria de petróleo e gás. Então, assim, é uma indústria que é de base tecnológica, né? É complexidade dos processos operacionais e de gerenciamento, altamente regulada, né? Elevados requisitos de saúde, segurança e meio ambiente, né? Então, ou seja, falar de um perfil específico, a gente tem que estar falando, falando de quê? Está falando de indústria naval? Está falando de serviços de IP? Está falando de serviços de apoio? Está falando de exploração? Está falando de desenvolvimento de produção? Assim, está falando de pesquisa tecnológica? Então, são vários perfis do capital humano. Bom, então, mas... Pronto. Bom, então, em termos assim, se a gente fosse falar assim, genericamente, feita essa ressalva, né, é uma formação que conjuga, né, aulas teóricas com aulas práticas, né, não existe isso, uma formação de um profissional da indústria de petróleo e gás que não considere simuladores, né, que não considere aquilo que o professor Michael falou, reproduzir, né, aquela condição né, de trabalho que já é adversa, severa, em um ambiente simulado, né? Então, você tem que ter laboratórios, né? Então, essa estrutura educacional diferenciada, né, uma equipe docente também especializada, né, constantemente aí up to date, né, a tecnologia, os requisitos de SMS, que produzem por si só uma carga horária elevadíssima de treinamentos que você tem que fazer, que são obrigatórios, né, se você considerar numa plataforma de petróleo, no mínimo são 600 horas de treinamento, só na parte normativa, né? Então, são NRs, e são treinamentos de requisitos mundiais, né? Então, assim, ou seja, em inglês, né? O idioma na plataforma é inglês, né? Então, para você embarcar, você tem que ter uma série de permissões. Você tem que fazer, assim, o gerente de plataforma, me lembro que era no mínimo 600 horas, isso tem que ser renovado, ano a ano. Né? Treinamentos para ambiente de risco, né? Quando trabalha, vai também numa refinaria, também você está exposto ali a calor, quando você vai no estaleiro, na indústria naval também, é uma condição de trabalho muito adversa, né, para o trabalhador. Né? E por isso mesmo, por toda essa diversidade de condições, é uma indústria muito regulada, sindicalizada, né? Ou seja, você tem muita penetração dos sindicatos nas atividades operacionais, por conta de toda essa adversidade das condições de trabalho. Você tem um longo tempo para a formação de profissional experiente, né? Você tem aí de 2 a 3 anos para um profissional ser considerado apto, né, para estar desempenhando ali, ou seja, não basta ele sair da faculdade, ou seja, ele tem que realmente, da escola técnica e da faculdade, né, ou seja, no mínimo que eu vejo pela experiência dos gerentes, né, 2 a 3 anos, e são categorias profissionais específicas, né, que às vezes não existem, né, então quando o professor estava falando de identidade, valores, quem é da área de petróleo e gás, né, já vou falar um pouquinho, né, que motiva, né, o que motiva a essas pessoas entrarem, né. Basicamente o que eu vejo é remuneração, é um setor que paga melhor do que as outras indústrias. No caso, é um setor que promove esse desenvolvimento, ou seja, porque como é uma empresa de base tecnológica, né, então, assim, uma indústria, né, então você tem realmente um desenvolvimento muito forte, tanto por parte da Petrobras, quanto por parte das operadoras, né, você tem alta possibilidade de expatriação, né, ou seja, você entra numa operadora, você está aqui, você pode ser enviado para a Noruega, né, para a África, no caso. Então, assim, você tem essa mobilidade, isso atrai um pouco o jovem que trabalha, né, o profissional que trabalha na indústria de petróleo e gás. Remuneração, a questão do idioma, né, que você tem que, né, para algumas funções você tem que ter fluência. A questão também, deixa eu ver se eu me lembro mais alguma coisa, a questão do desenvolvimento, né, a questão da polivalência, né, ou seja, você, no nível superior, né, o nível técnico, né, o perfil da indústria de petróleo ele é basicamente formado por profissionais de educação básica, a maioria, né, se você considerar uma plataforma, se você considerar uma refinaria, um estaleiro, a maioria é de nível técnico, a maioria é nível médio, e você tem ali cerca de, vamos supor, aí, 60-40, nível 40%, 30% nível superior, mas é uma indústria intensiva em mão de obra técnica, né, então, ou seja, você tem um desafio aí também de qualificação na educação profissional. Bom, então, deixa eu passar aqui. Cadê o coisa? Cadê o coisa? Hã? Cadê o passador? Tá. Bom, então, eu trouxe aqui alguns dados também para compartilhar com a plateia. Essa foi uma pesquisa que foi feita pela Fundação Dom Cabral em 2014, com empresários brasileiros, perguntando quais eram as funções várias indústrias, tá? Não era só a indústria de petróleo, não. Quais são as funções que você tem o maior gap de qualificação no Brasil? E aí apareceu técnico, né, função técnico e função de operação. Pode passar? Ah, sim. Tá. E também uma outra pesquisa que eu trouxe do Manpower Group, na parte de... o Manpower já vem fazendo uma pesquisa, né, sobre a falta de profissionais qualificados, né, shortage survey, talent shortage survey, em que nas Américas, né, a Manpower também aponta, né, são as 10 funções, né, difícil de preencher, né, são os skilled trade workers, né, e os technicians, né. Então, de novo, skilled trade são eletricistas, manutenção, no caso eles consideram também chefes, pessoal de cozinha, restaurante, né, e os técnicos. Então, são as duas posições mais difíceis de você preencher no recrutamento e seleção. E quais são as principais causas? Ou falta de candidatos, ou quando tem candidato, falta as competências, né, ou você falta experiência, o que acaba fazendo com que as empresas elas diminuam os seus requisitos de contratação para que essas pessoas possam entrar, né? Então, essa é a principal consequência. Bom, e no Brasil, a educação profissional ela precisa avançar, né? Nos países desenvolvidos, né, 50% dos estudantes escolhem educação profissional, né? Educação profissional, no Brasil, ela representa, segundo dados do Senai, 6,6%, ou seja, você tem na população brasileira, primeiro, uma quantidade de jovens, hoje, segundo o IBGE, né, segundo acho que são pelo menos 9 milhões de jovens que não estudam nem trabalham, né, que são os considerados jovens nem. E desses que decidem estudar, ou seja, a grande maioria assim, escolhe entrar na universidade, né? Sendo que, para a indústria de petróleo e gás, há muita oportunidade para nível técnico, né? Muitas vezes ganham até melhores salários do que o profissional de nível superior, né? Um profissional nível técnico, com 10 anos de experiência, que tem aquela série de certificações que eu falei para vocês, de trabalho embarcado, que sabe inglês, esse cara é pago a peso de ouro pelas operadoras, né? Às vezes ele ganha muito mais que um próprio engenheiro que está aqui onshore, né? Então, ou seja, é considerado ainda baixo, né, a questão da educação profissional no Brasil. Acho que não. Foi. Aí eu só estou trazendo aqui um parâmetro, né, assim, para a gente falar então, educação profissional, nível técnico, né, número de matrículas, né, e embaixo ali, educação superior, né, número de matrículas, né, ou seja, ambas estão crescentes, né, o número de matrículas, porém, quando você pega a taxa de concluintes, né, é que eu não tinha o dado do MEC de concluintes para educação profissional, por isso eu optei trazer o de matrículas, né. A taxa de conclusão da educação profissional é cerca de 80%, e a taxa de nível do educação superior, ela não chega nem a 50%. Né, ou seja, você, na área de engenharia, o número de concluintes de engenharia é menos chega a ser uma perda de 30% que chegam a se formar, né, entram e aí 30% a 40% se formam, concluem a graduação, né, então, ou seja, também é uma questão também a ser avaliada. Aí eu trouxe também alguns dados aqui de cursos assim, específicos, nível de educação superior, ligados à área de petróleo, né, que é o curso de engenharia naval e o curso de engenharia de petróleo, né, ou seja, você tem aí por ano, formados cerca de 3.200 pessoas, nesses cursos que são, teoricamente, são os cursos vocacionados para a indústria, né, porque a gente aproveita, claro, outras engenharias, né, engenharia mecânica, elétrica, né, eletrônica, instrumentação, mas essas duas a gente percebe assim, que seriam pessoas que gostariam de trabalhar na indústria de petróleo e gás, né, então você vê que a formação é considerada baixa. É uma formação, uma graduação assim, que a seguir, né, os desafios aí postos pelo pré-sal e pela dinâmica da indústria, ainda é considerado um pequeno, né, um quantitativo pequeno de formandos, né. Temos 75 cursos no Brasil, né, engenharia naval junto com engenharia de petróleo, e dentre os 75, né, de acordo com o conceito do MEC, a gente fica aí meio a meio, né? Ou seja, 48% de escolas aí conceito 5 ou 4 e 52% conceito 3, 2 ou 1 do MEC. Então, isso reflete, quando eu conversava com os gerentes de RH, os gerentes da área operacional, dos estaleiros, das refinarias, né? Como eles veem isso, né? Porque, olha, o engenheiro que chega aqui não sabe trabalhar, né? É o que eles sempre falavam. Mas como não sabe trabalhar? Né? Porque muitas vezes você tem que ver também como foi aquela formação daquele engenheiro, né? Então, eles falavam muito isso, eles reclamavam muito esse conceito assim, de falta de mão de obra, né, quando fala que está tendo um apagão, falta de mão de obra, é muito pelo lado, às vezes você tem o candidato, mas é muito de você conseguir recrutar o candidato com aquela competência. Né? Você consegue, você abre um processo seletivo, você tem, mas você não encontra um candidato que preencha os requisitos técnicos da empresa. Né? Principalmente qualificação, que é o que eles falam. Porque na parte de valores, assim, eu acho que todos eles têm falado que têm encontrado, né, pessoas com atitudes mais proativas, mas a questão da qualificação realmente tem sido um hiato. Bom, aí, então, tem uma pesquisa feita pela CNI, né, que fala justamente assim, perguntado para contratantes, né, gerentes, contratantes da indústria, né, quais são as competências-chave que eles gostariam de ver nos engenheiros recém-formados, né? Olha, capacidade de trabalhar em equipe, de absorver novos conhecimentos, domínio de conceitos como qualidade total e preservação ambiental, aptidão para identificar problemas, percepção do que acontece no mercado, conhecimento de aspectos legais e normativos, entendimento de fenômenos em áreas básicas, capacidade de conhecer e operar sistemas complexos, espírito investigativo, capacidade de desenvolvimento tecnológico e domínio de línguas estrangeiras. Ora, exigir isso de um profissional recém-formado, eu acho, às vezes, muito pesado, né? Porque, conforme eu falei, né, às vezes ele tem uma deficiência na própria formação, da sua formação básica e da educação superior, e quando ele chega a campo, eu mesmo vi muitos engenheiros júniores tendo que liderar equipes de mais de 200 pessoas. Né? Então, assim, é preciso também que as empresas invistam no treinamento. Né? No treinamento, assim, quando esse profissional chega na empresa, ao invés de esperar que ele já venha com todas essas competências, é preciso que a empresa invista, né? Faça um treinamento com esse profissional, coloque ele em viagens, né, em missões internacionais, para ele conhecer outros empreendimentos também no mundo, né, ou seja, faça essa disseminação do conhecimento, né, porque daí é que às vezes vem essa percepção de que falta mão de obra. Tem um artigo do IPEA que fala sobre isso, que fala do hiato geracional também que houve na área de engenharia na década de 80, 90, né, onde os formandos da área de engenharia, eles migraram, né, devido aí à recessão, né, eles migraram para as funções não típicas. Então, migraram para mercado financeiro, migraram para outras funções, né? E quando a indústria voltou a crescer, né, em 2007, principalmente, ali quando foi a 97, né, com a quebra da lei do petróleo, né, do monopólio, e aí quando a Petrobras começou efetivamente a ter valores assim vultosos de investimento no seu plano de negócios, aí você não tem esses engenheiros em sênior e média carreira, né? Por quê? Porque esses engenheiros foram para outras áreas, né? E isso aconteceu também, agora passou com a indústria naval, né? Esse boom que teve de você ter aí mais de 6 novos estaleiros, né, instalados aqui no Brasil, era muito difícil você ter essa mão de obra técnica, né? Foi falado, né? Por quê? Os soldadores, os eletricistas, eles acabaram migrando para outras áreas, né, para as outras atividades, e tem o pessoal do Sinaval que falava, às vezes, assim, o estaleiro estava entregando panfleto na praça, olha, se você tem, você não precisa nem só levar sua carteira, você é admitido, se você trabalhou em alguma vez na vida em estaleiro, você vai lá, leva os seus documentos que você vai ser admitido, você nem precisa só levar. Então, né, e é triste, né, porque a indústria naval estava assim, realmente, né, já estava com uma perspectiva aí de chegar a 100 mil empregos, né, com novos empreendimentos, e está sendo desmantelada novamente, né, aquilo que foi nos anos 90, né, ou seja, esse ressurgimento da indústria naval, agora você está vendo aí uma grande onda de demissões na indústria naval brasileira. Bom, aqui também eu trago alguns dados assim para falar um pouquinho também da produtividade, né? O Brasil ele tem ficado para trás na questão da produtividade. Isso é um fator assim determinante que eu vejo na indústria de petróleo e gás. Você tem assim tem estudos, né, que você tem um percentual de tempo parado muito grande, né? Tempo parado é esperar equipamento, esperar instrução. Tem um dado também interessante do IHS-CIRA, que, claro, a produtividade também tem a ver com capital humano, né, de que um supervisor coreano, falei da Coreia, né, um supervisor coreano consegue supervisionar uma equipe de 20 técnicos, enquanto no Brasil um supervisor consegue supervisionar uma equipe de 5. Né? Por quê? Porque os operários, os trabalhadores, eles precisam estar constantemente perguntando, né? Até por a questão da formação educacional, eles precisam estar sempre, eles não têm autonomia, né? Eles não têm, eles não conseguem tomar uma micro decisão, eles têm que estar sempre recorrendo ao supervisor, né? Ou seja, até entender o plano de trabalho. Né, às vezes o trabalhador ele não consegue entender o plano, né, então isso também é uma questão, é um fator aí considerado. Opa, mais para o lado. Isso, aí aqui também tem um estudo do IPEA falando que a qualificação da força de trabalho é um principal obstáculo para aumento da produtividade. Também foi uma pesquisa que foi feita, então, novamente, a qualificação aparece. Eu também destaco também os métodos de gestão, né? Justamente controle e gestão da produtividade é um assunto que precisa ser enaltecido na indústria, né? Ter métricas, ter indicadores, né? Ou seja, isso é bem importante. Aí o absenteísmo ali também aparece, também, que eu destaquei. Isso. Bom, aqui eu também trago uma estatística do Centro de Gestão e Estudos Estratégicos. Na parte de mestrado e doutorado, a indústria de petróleo, ela tem assim, vocês podem ver destacados ali, não consegue atrair, né, a maioria dos doutores e de mestres, eles estão na educação, e em segundo lugar na área de saúde. Né? A indústria de petróleo aparece ali com um percentual assim, muito baixo. Né? Então, ou seja, chega a ser um paradoxo, né? Porque é uma indústria de alta tecnologia com pouca alocação de mestres e doutores. Né? E também trago um desafio que é professor também, Michael, estava comentando sobre isso, né, da gerência, né? Trago um desafio da questão da supervisão e dessa média gerência nas indústrias, nos empreendimentos, indústria naval, Petrobras também, a gente pode dizer que é sempre um desafio, porque esse cara ali que está ali, né, no centro, né, que eu estou representando, esse cara, ele às vezes ele não tem uma formação, ele é de um nível técnico, ele não tem uma formação em liderança, e ele tem que ter uma série de papéis que às vezes ele era só um bom técnico que foi promovido. Então ele tem que dialogar com uma gerência de projeto, quer dizer, todo um conhecimento, às vezes, que o engenheiro chega para falar com ele, que ele nem entende, né? Coordenar esforços, né? Às vezes, como eu falei, né, são equipes de 200 pessoas, né? Disseminar os procedimentos e as normas, né? Cobrar isso, fazer reuniões diárias, tem os diálogos de SMS que são feitos diariamente, tem que gerenciar conflito e tem que buscar esse comprometimento para o aumento da produtividade. Então, eu vejo isso como um grande desafio, assim, como um desafio, e a gente tem poucas escolas hoje no Brasil que treinam essa supervisão, né? Porque você trabalhar com esse nível gerencial é muito assim, muito na prática, né? Muito ali, é uma habilidade muito hands-on ali, muito na prática, e não você chegar com um conteúdo que ele nem vai absorver, ele nem vai conseguir repassar. Então, também eu considero isso como um desafio. E aí, falando um pouquinho do PROMIMP, né, o PROMIMP ele foi criado em 2003. Né, o PROMIMP ele é coordenado pelo Ministério de Minas e Energia, e a coordenação executiva do PROMIMP sempre coube à Petrobras. O coordenador executivo do PROMIMP é o meu gerente, eu estou localizada no gabinete do presidente, então o coordenador executivo ele também acumula, assim como eu sou gerente na Petrobras, ele também tem uma função lá, né, na Petrobras. E ele foi concebido justamente para isso, para tentar mobilizar, né, a indústria de forma a ter condições de fornecer, né, para a Petrobras, para a indústria de petróleo e gás, né, considerando que a Petrobras aí 90% da produção é da Petrobras. Então, você tem linhas de atuação, né, você tem aqui a parte de capacidade industrial e desempenho, você tem a parte de qualificação, instrumentos de política industrial e inovação e desenvolvimento tecnológico, né, tudo isso para tentar maximizar o conteúdo local. Então, dentro dessas linhas, dentro desses eixos, você tem projetos, né? Você tem uma série de projetos, ou seja, o PROMIMP ele reúne BNDES, reúne a CNI, reúne a BIMAC, a BINE, né, várias instituições representativas da indústria, e para discutir. Então, são projetos que são debatidos sempre com esse intuito de maximizar a participação da indústria. E um desses projetos, naquele eixo de qualificação, foi o Plano Nacional de Qualificação Profissional, né, que foi lançado em 2006 e já capacitou um total aí de 100 mil pessoas. Né, eram cursos que o PROMIMP fazia, né, em 2015 a gente trabalhou muito com empresa, mas o PROMIMP publicava editais de qualificação profissional. Né? Não sei se vocês se lembram, então foram mais ou menos 100 mil profissionais qualificados, a maioria na parte de construção e montagem, né, a parte de engenharia ali também, operação, manutenção e engenharia civil. Né? Então, a gente teve uma abrangência aí nacional. E esses recursos que a Petrobras utilizou nessa qualificação são recursos oriundos da participação especial, é o investimento em P&D, é a cláusula da ANP, né, que a gente tem que investir em P&D, então a gente investe na qualificação sob autorização da ANP. Eu preciso, né, e lá justamente eu que faço essa gestão. A gente precisa, cada vez que investe, ter a autorização da ANP para poder fazer esse investimento, porque isso debita da nossa obrigação contratual, né, de investimento em pesquisa e desenvolvimento. Da mesma forma, o Pramimp também custeou a instalação de infraestrutura educacional, né? O primeiro, 2 exemplos que eu estou trazendo aqui, né? O primeiro foi o Centro de Formação de Oficiais da Marinha Mercante, né? Ou seja, toda embarcação tem que ter um profissional, tem que ter um oficial náutico, né? Então, você tinha por alguns estudos, a gente identificou que teria um hiato nessa qualificação, e o Pramimp, ele expandiu a capacidade de forma dos centros logísticos, né, que esses oficiais, eles estudam 3 anos em regime de internato. Então, o Pramimp, ele custeou o aumento da instalação e do alojamento, né, aumentando aí a capacidade, né, do CIAGA passou de 500 para 720 alunos, e do CIABA de 328 para 712. Então, houve um aumento na formação, na disponibilidade desses profissionais no mercado. E o segundo, que a gente também custeou, com recurso também da participação especial, foram simuladores, né, aí, firmados aí entre a Petrobras e o Senai, no âmbito do Pramimp, simulador e controle de lastro, centro de treinamento em ambientes de atmosfera explosiva, e o simulador de processos e facilidades de petróleo. Também foi feito em Macaé o simulador de guindaste offshore, né, aquilo que eu falei, né, tentar reproduzir em sala de aula condições que o trabalhador vai encontrar na produção, na operação. Bom, então, como conclusão, né, um resumo, né, então, eu pontuei aqui alguns desafios. O primeiro ponto que eu ressalto, né, é dessa heterogeneidade na formação, né, do capital intelectual da indústria de petróleo e gás. É uma indústria que emprega, em maior parte, técnicos, né, então, técnicos, e, em segundo lugar, engenharia, né, então você precisa aumentar a qualidade na formação dessas 2 funções. Você tem que melhorar bastante a questão do gerenciamento, né, da produtividade, né, execução de programas para formação da liderança operacional e aumentar a interação entre a universidade e a indústria, que foi aquele quadro que eu trouxe da alocação de mestres e doutores na nossa indústria. E como metas, né, para o Pramimp nos anos seguintes, né, a gente deixa um pouco também de enfatizar essa questão da qualificação profissional de nível técnico, para passar um pouco a enfocar competitividade e inovação, né, isso que o meu gerente tem falado, o coordenador executivo tem falado muito de enfatizar isso, né, tornar as empresas, né, brasileiras, né, fornecedores, todos aqueles 4 elos, né, dar condições a elas de competitividade, né, preço, prazo também, qualidade, programas de qualificação de alta especialização, né, a gente quer investir um pouco nisso. Aí no lado dos técnicos, né, a gente investir um pouco na certificação desses profissionais, ou seja, né, no mundo isso já é feito, né, certificação de técnicos, né, então a gente está estudando sobre isso, de Pramimp lançar esse programa para certificar técnicos, né, ele vai fazer a qualificação, ele vai fazer o treinamento, e depois ele vai fazer uma prova, né, onde ele vai ter um certificado válido nacionalmente. E com relação à indústria naval, completar essa curva de aprendizado, né, a Petrobras tem a Pramimp, né, um grande foco do Pramimp tem sido, né, a indústria naval, e para a gente ajudar eles nas questões aí, principalmente de gerenciamento, suprimento, fornecimento local, capacitação. Então, era basicamente isso que eu tinha para apresentar.
Muitíssimo obrigada. Thank you very much. We are going now to open to the floor for questions. Okay, and we have some people with like microphones. If someone wants to ask a question, please. I think I'll collect a few questions and then I'll ask the table to answer them together.
Olá, bom dia.
Bom dia.
Eu queria perguntar para a Dília até que ponto você acha que a universidade ela é capaz de fornecer, a universidade ou até, de repente, a escola técnica, é capaz de fornecer as habilidades para o profissional que ele vai aplicar na prática, ou até o outro lado, né, que a empresa precisa dar um treinamento específico para determinadas tarefas que ele vai fazer. Eu vejo muitas empresas reclamando da mão de obra e tal, etc., mas eu também vejo muitas vezes essas empresas reclamando, não dando o treinamento necessário para o profissional atender as expectativas deles. E eu queria saber a sua visão, até que ponto você acha, até onde a universidade ou a escola consegue qualificar, que também tem que dar uma visão geral para o profissional, né? E até que ponto também a própria empresa tem que pegar e direcionar ele para as habilidades que ela precisa. Obrigado.
Nada. Olha, realmente, são esses dois lados. Na parte da academia, né, eu acredito que assim, uma forma de você melhorar é você fazer estágios supervisionados. As empresas reclamam muito, né? Assim, poxa, o profissional, o engenheiro, o administrador também, né? Assim, estou falando em engenheiro, mas assim, o administrador, o engenheiro, ele poderia fazer mais estágios nas empresas, ter mais essa vivência na empresa. Quando ele chegasse lá, ele já tivesse assim, mais domínio ali daquele ambiente empresarial. Agora, do lado da empresa, eu acredito também que não dá para esperar que ele, né, tenha todas aquelas competências ali, né, sem investir numa qualificação. Então, eu acho que nos dois lados, acho que cabem melhorias, né? A universidade fazer essa maior aproximação com o mundo empresarial através de estágios, vivências, visitas, né, missões, né, empresariais, né, ou seja, para você conhecer, né, conhecer como é que é uma plataforma, como é que é uma refinaria, como é que é um empreendimento, né, na indústria de petróleo e gás, né, você também na parte de mestres e doutores, né, eu sei que tem um relatório, né, que um relatório de pesquisa tecnológica, né, que poderia ser feito, né, poderia ser mais incentivado, né, porque como eu vejo muito a publicação assim, acadêmica em termos de papers, né, em termos assim, de publicação científica, mas aqueles relatórios, né, o próprio SEMPES, por exemplo, né, o SEMPES da Petrobras, ele tem acordos, ele tem mais de mil acordos com universidades, ele tem, se eu não me engano, 88 redes temáticas. Redes temáticas o que o SEMPES gere, é uma união entre a universidade e a Petrobras, né, para pesquisar um tema. Né, então, ou seja, e o SEMPES ele tem, acho que mais de 1000 acordos de tecnologia. Né? Então, ou seja, esses profissionais, né, da indústria também poderia ser, a universidade poderia valorar esses relatórios, né, poderia valorar mais. Né? E no caso, então, das empresas, é realmente investir no treinamento inicial.
Temos mais algumas questões. Eu gostaria de pegar as várias questões, assim a gente pode... por favor.
A minha pergunta vai também para você. Baseado naquelas habilidades que o CNI levantou,
Sim,
que me parecem extremamente genéricas, mas extremamente importantes, eu queria saber o seguinte: quando você compara, né, uma universidade brasileira, evidentemente tem de todos os níveis, mas na média, com universidades de fora, existe algum estudo mostrando que aquelas habilidades que a CNI prevê, que sejam de quem entra inicialmente na empresa, como lá fora, universidades de fora e daqui se comparam? Ou seja, a qualificação de um engenheiro de fora, comparado com o brasileiro, como é que está? Porque você tem empresas grandes que podem fazer treinamento e gastar, tipo Petrobras e tudo mais. Mas você tem engenheiro que vai para pequena empresa e que se aquelas habilidades estiverem com a pessoa, com certeza ele leva um tempo muito pequeno para se adaptar.
sim.
Então, qual é porque provavelmente é aí que nós temos que mexer. Principalmente se comparações com outros países mostram que eles estão muito à frente nesse sentido.
Passa para o Fernando, por favor. Pode?
Não, eu ia perguntar para a Adília sobre a questão do gap ali que você mostrou que tem no mercado. A gente sabe que a Petrobras atuou junto com universidades, inclusive havia cursos que nem existiam antes e que ela fez todo um esforço para criar junto com a universidade. Exatamente. O que vocês têm feito em relação a esse gap atualmente? Vocês continuam com essas parcerias?
Na Petrobras, né?
É.
Tá. Bom, então... tá.
Adília, eu sou Fernando Potti. Eu só queria colocar uma questão para que a gente possa refletir no que você falou, o professor Michael também. Eu acompanho bem a indústria de petróleo, eu sou um profissional dessa área e acompanhei muito, desde 2003, 2004, o PROMIMP e todas essas ações. O que eu reparo, né, que eu queria que a gente pudesse refletir junto? O que eu reparo hoje, em 2015, é que todas as políticas públicas, as grandes políticas públicas, para a gente resolver o problema da competitividade da nossa indústria e principalmente a questão de mão de obra, falta, aí eu queria ver muito a sua opinião, acho que falta uma governança, eu acho que falta uma questão que integre, né? A gente tem diversos atores que acabam fazendo a mesma coisa e acabam batendo cabeça, né? Então você tem aí o PROMIMP, que eu sou um fã do PROMIMP, eu acho que a Petrobras tem feito um trabalho importante. Aí você tem a Firjan, você vai ter a CNI, você vai ter o IBP, você vai ter a Unip, você vai ter as universidades, e todo mundo tentando resolver esse foco. E o que a gente percebe? A gente acaba espraiando demais e a gente perdeu esse foco, né? Então, eu entendo que não falta, não é o que a gente deve fazer, né? Porque a gente já tem muita competência. Então, o grande desafio hoje, eu repare, gostaria muito de ouvir a sua opinião, é como a gente aglutinar isso, né? A gente sabe que a gente tem o número de doutores, a gente sabe que a gente tem as empresas, a cadeia de suprimento está aí. Aí, quando a gente chega no resultado final, a gente vê que um conteúdo local ficou muito espraiado, a gente vê que os investimentos de políticas públicas, que não foram poucos, mas acabaram trazendo pouco resultado, né? O próprio PROMIMP, ele capacitou um número muito grande de mão de obra. Na hora que essa mão de obra tenta entrar na indústria, faltava experiência, então a própria Petrobras não podia contratar, né? O PROMIMP treina, mas a própria Petrobras não podia contratar porque a gente não tem experiência. Ou seja, a gente percebe que as ferramentas para fazer a política pública avançar a gente tem. O que está faltando? Essa governança. Recentemente, né, teve o Brasil Maior, que tentou aglutinar isso, depois né? Como é que a gente resolve esse gap? Porque se a gente resolver esse gap, eu acho que a gente tem uma força grande para canalizar esforço no mesmo direcionamento.
É verdade. Qual é a primeira? Eu tinha até esquecido.
Nós vamos recolher só mais duas questões, que já tem pessoas e, por favor, a gente pede que vocês sejam bem resumidos, porque a gente está com um problema de tempo. Por favor.
If it's okay, I'll ask in English, which is for Professor Piori. So, for you. Yeah. Got it. Okay, good for you. So you described two tendencies. One is sort of bureaucratic regulation, which seems to be kind of static, and the other are these social identities, which seemed, maybe I'm wrong, to be more flexible or more dynamic. And so the question is, can you get good bureaucratic regulation? You mentioned 4 instruments, but I'm just trying to figure out if what's codified in the legislation actually can deal with these dynamics in a positive way consistently.
Okay, and please, the last one.
Para o professor,
Michael, for you.
Professor, na indústria de óleo, de petróleo, escândalos e corrupções é uma coisa comum, desde o início do século passado, e vem acontecendo depois da quebra do monopólio do Rockefeller. O senhor diria que os países latinos, essa corrupção dentro dessa indústria, ela acontece em maior grau porque ela é uma jovem no mercado internacional, um novo player no mercado internacional, ou porque isso dentro da indústria de petróleo é quase que uma coisa comum?
Adília, por favor.
Tá. Bom, então aqui por ordem, né, vamos ver aqui as perguntas. A primeira falava dessa diferença, né, da universidade brasileira e da estrangeira, né, na formação do nível superior, né, dos engenheiros. Bom, eu tenho contato com algumas instituições estrangeiras, também tenho contato com esses empresários, né, da indústria. O que eu vejo, a diferença é, primeiro, vou falar de engenharia, né? Primeiro, por exemplo, eu sei que tem um dado nos Estados Unidos que a maioria dos PhDs formados, né, na área de engenharia estão nas indústrias. Né? Ou seja, então eles têm maior penetração na indústria e eles dão aula na academia, né, também. Então, ou seja, eles fazem essa ligação do prático para o teórico, né? Eles são contratados e eles têm muita experiência profissional e eles dão aulas para os engenheiros, então baseado também fortemente em sua própria experiência profissional. Então, isso é um fator que eu tenho visto. E o segundo é um investimento das universidades estrangeiras em termos de competitividade, empreendedorismo, né, o que eles falam também dos soft skills, né, o hard skills é a parte do conhecimento técnico, né, os soft skills é isso, liderança, atitude, comunicação, negociação, então que eles têm uma carga de treinamento muito elevada. Então, basicamente, assim, o que eu assim, da minha experiência, o que eu vejo é isso. Então, essa maior ligação com a indústria e a parte ali de inovação, competitividade e empreendedorismo. Na parte com relação à Petrobras, sim, a Petrobras ela tem uma universidade corporativa, ela realmente foi uma das primeiras que estruturou, né, um curso de petróleo, né, na época, né, dos seus primórdios, né. Então, ela continua formando, né, todo empregado, né, o empregado da Petrobras ele tem que passar por um concurso, né. Então, todo empregado da Petrobras ele passa por um curso de formação que varia aí de 6 meses a 1 ano, né. Né, então, assim, situando o pessoal de nível médio, né, mas o pessoal de nível superior, ele passa por um curso de formação. E a Petrobras, com certeza, ela tá reafirmando isso, né, isso é uma política que já está dentro da empresa, né, essa forma, a Petrobras a Petrobras já entendeu justamente que não basta o empregado chegar recém-formado, ela tem que investir. Um curso de engenharia de petróleo são 12 meses, acho, entendeu? Então, ele fica lá na Bahia estudando e tendo contato com a operação, ou seja, ele está ali estudando 12 meses para depois ele pensar em assumir alguma função, né? E a terceira pergunta foi a questão da governança. Realmente, né? Realmente, assim, são várias iniciativas, né? Como você falou, é o IBP, é o Promimp, é o Brasil Maior, são os ministérios também que tem, e falta essa convergência, né? Só que a gente entende que, assim, que não é a Petrobras que vai dar essa convergência, né, desses esforços para a indústria de petróleo. Eu acho que tem que ser uma instância superior, né? Não é a Petrobras que vai poder, olha, vamos convergir. O Promimp está tentando ter uma linha mais, assim, até porque o Promimp ele tem já, né, no seu board ali, né, ele tem as associações, os ministérios. Então, assim, definir uma política assim, de qualificação, né, você mobilizar a indústria, o Promimp tem feito isso. Mas assim, não cabe somente a Petrobras esse papel, né, de indutor, né, dessa política, quase uma política industrial, né? Então, assim, não cabe a Petrobras. A gente entende que tenha que ser uma instância superior.
Obrigada. Michael?
Okay, well, I'm not quite sure how to respond in a coherent way to the different questions that were asked. I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure how to respond in a coherent way to the questions that were asked. I would say that a major problem that I hear continually in not just in Brazil but in Latin America in general is the problem of bureaucracy. There are too many rules to be followed. That takes too long to get approval. There's too much red tape involved in getting projects off the ground. And I think that bureaucracy arises from two basic issues. One is the issue of corruption. That is, in order to prevent corruption and deal with it, you impose more and more rules and regulations that control behavior. The other problem is the attempt to overcome a lack of skill. Because what you really, that is this problem whereby you deal with the missing skills by having a supervisor and a series of people with partial skills underneath him or her, and then you overcome the problem of the fact that the skills are incomplete means that lower level workers can't solve all the problems, and they're continually referring to higher levels in order to get the problem solved. And so that you have a bureaucratic hierarchy as a substitute for skill. And the other thing that is in the past, if you look at production, say, in the United States, there was a tremendous emphasis on the division of labor and of breaking down tasks into small pieces and assigning them to unskilled workers. The result of Japanese management techniques that have spread in the 80s and 90s is a movement towards integration, a movement away from unskilled, breaking down things into component parts, and a movement in order to get people who are multitasked, who can coordinate without having to go through a hierarchy, who know different, and a kind of reintegration across different skills. So I think there are those two tendencies working. On the one hand, the problem to combat bureaucracy, and the other is the problem to overcome low skills, overcome the lack of skills. And I don't really know how those two issues interact with each other. But I think that in a way you could say that the problem of low skills is a problem of development just has gone too fast. That you have created an industrial structure that hasn't, that you have, it doesn't, that is the population doesn't keep up with the pace of development of an industrial structure. And one way to look at that is that you have that investment in education and educational institutions has been insufficient. But the other way to look at it is that industrial development has been too fast. And I think you have to recognize that both of these elements are involved.
Okay. Well, actually, we have to go for a break. We have a half break outside. I would ask if you can reconvene in 10-15 minutes, because so that we keep up the time. And thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. And thank you,
Monica.
I hope you stay over, and so that we can continue our conversation.
Obrigada. Thank you.
Yes, with you. Yes, I'm going to send to you, and it's available.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. That was very good. Que bom. Gostei. Você participa mais do nosso grupo, também participa do... Eu queria conversar com você.
Com o maior prazer, te recebo lá, se você quiser, na Faperj. Vou te deixar meu cartão. Tá bom? Pensei que não estava acadêmica. Eu fosse mais uma experiência prática.
Eu achei ótimo. Na verdade, é exatamente isso que a gente queria. Achei excelente.
Ai, que bom.
Achei excelente. Eu acho que as pessoas tinham umas perguntas, mas pena que...
Sim.
E assim, eu tinha perguntas, mas aí já estava começando, a gente começou um pouquinho mais tarde por causa dela. Tá bom, eu vou deixar o seu cartão aqui. Não, eu vou ter que voltar. Mas assim, pode...
entrepreneurship, technological change and management, innovation, and he combines this with sustainability. This includes that he's not only looking to find private returns in capital, but he's also looking to those technologies who can bring a social and environmental return to society. And in this regard, he has been consulting agencies in sustainability and technology areas, and he has led several researchers on issues involved in new business development in emerging markets. So he will share with us some thoughts on sustainable industrial development. And then after that, we will have some questions for Mr. Atul Watt. And then we have Renato Lima, who is Brazilian, but is studying, is a PhD candidate at MIT, studying political science. His dissertation project is oriented to public policies related to the oil and gas industry. And in this, he focuses on Brazil, Mexico, and Malaysia. And today he will share with us some experiences of Mexico, where this summer he spent at the Mexican Secretariat of Energy. So, and he will be share with us looking over the border, what is going on in Mexico, and to see what we can maybe take away from there. So, please, Mr. Watt, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Oh, thanks. Oops. Oh, thank you. This is for me. Good afternoon. I'd like to first start off by thanking EBAPE and the Fundación Julio Vargas for inviting me here, and particularly Professor Monica and the Dean. It's always a pleasure to come to Rio. I've been here a few times, and I mean this seriously. I have traveled a lot, and I think Rio is the most beautiful city in the world, and I hope it stays that way. Thank you. And I've been to Rio several times. I don't speak Portuguese, but I've learned that you only need to know 3 words to actually be okay in Rio. One is bom dia, one is obrigado, and the third is caipirinha. Anyway, I didn't come here to talk about Brazilian cocktails. This is what I'm going to talk about. I know it's a long title, but my background, as Charlotte said, is sustainable development, and particularly with focus on technology and innovation, and how technological change can be used and developed to promote the goals of sustainability and sustainable development in society. The argument I want to make is a slightly different kind of argument based on work we're doing at Columbia University, which is on the intersection between the different sectors of the economy and their implications for industrial policy. And in particular, within that, I want to focus on the energy and water sectors. I mean, there are many other sectors that are relevant, like food and health, etc. But for the purpose of today, I think I'll stay limited to energy and water. Why? Because it is an area that is of growing interest around the world, and I'll explain that. And as I understand it, both water and energy are serious issues in Brazil today, and Brazil is facing a serious water crisis. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with sustainability, but I thought I'd just give you a brief review of how I look at it and how we look at it. Essentially, sustainability is basically going beyond the classical, traditional notion of development, which is purely based on economics, and including social and environmental factors in the metric of how a society develops. The United Nations launched a 15-year program last year called the Sustainable Development Goals Program, which some of you may have heard of. This is to follow the Millennium Development Goals, which is the previous 15 years, and it is a concept that is becoming current or has become current worldwide. It is both a public and private sector challenge because sustainability implies the development of new business models, what they call PPP, or basically make money, improve the environment, and improve society. The triple bottom line, we call it. It also needs new policies and policy structures. You find that both in universities, which are opening up departments of sustainable development and sustainable business, such as Cornell and I think MIT also. But also new kinds of policy-making mechanisms, which integrate the different sectors of the economy into this one thing. It's an interdisciplinary approach, unlike conventional socioeconomic development, which is more focused on economics. It involves a variety of disciplines, engineering, the social sciences, and economics, of course. And unlike economic development, which is really relatively easy, I shouldn't say easy, relatively easier, simpler to quantify because economics is a quantifiable discipline. When you start incorporating environmental and more soft kinds of variables, you get a more complex problem. And that requires a more complex kind of optimization, which is what we are struggling with in Colombia right now. And the other thing is these policies are no longer simply national, is that sustainability goes down to the ground, right down to the last person on earth. And so you need to look at sustainability at all different levels of society. So that's my little primer on sustainable development. Please feel free to stop me, interrupt me, and for clarification anytime. You don't need to wait till the end. Okay, coming to Brazil. I don't look at energy as only just energy. And I looked at the Brazilian government, and these are the ministries that I found as being very relevant to the energy sector in Brazil. I may have missed a couple. Of course, the Ministry of Mines and Energy is central, but all the other ones, in one way or the other, definitely the Ministry of Environment, definitely the Ministry of Science and Technology, because technology is a key player in what is facing a situation today, and the other ones. And agriculture, of course, is very important because agriculture and energy are very closely united. Okay. But broadly speaking, as I understand it, and my background is more, as Charlotte said, is partly academic on the policy side and on the business management and policy side, where in Colombia I'm connected with the policy science school, and partly on the engineering and technology side, where I went into the engineering department. But industrial policy generally, straight out of Economics 101, involves developing policies to improve productivity, increase industrial and activity, economic growth, generate employment and social welfare and social equity, promote exports, foreign trade, increase competitiveness, and promote technological innovation, which is really the pillars of industrial policy. Oops, sorry. I lost. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, but I see energy as central to the economy. It has an impact on every aspect of your economic, social life. Works obviously in industry, agriculture, services. It is important at the municipal and domestic level, right down to the household. I know electricity is expensive in Jamaica, where I'm living, and it affects the poor very much, the cost. And it is fundamental to society. And it is also critical to sustainable development, because one of the pillars of sustainable development is the protection of the environment and dealing with problems like climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now I must apologize. I pulled out this data, which may not be the most accurate, but I looked at the picture of sources and uses of energy in Brazil. And I found that hydropower is 70% of total usage in Brazil. And I hope I'm correct. That's oil actually is mainly about 40% of production and mainly used in transportation and in the thermoelectric plants to generate energy. Mineral coal is mainly used by industry, particularly steel and hydropower generation. Biofuels, which is mainly ethanol, I guess, amounts to about 7.6%. And then natural gas is 11%, and then other, which is solar and nuclear, et cetera, about 3 to 4%. This is just the profile of where energy comes from, how much, and where it's used in Brazil. I hope I'm correct. But moving on from that, if I can. Okay, here's some facts that I want to point out to you, which some of you may be familiar with, is which are related to why I'm talking about energy and water in this talk. 45% of water is lost in the world globally, actually, mainly due to very poor infrastructure, plumbing, piping, other kinds of waste. And that is actually losing energy because that water has been treated and has consumed energy to be produced. So you have an infrastructure problem. This is extremely true in the United States, where there's great concern that the antiquated infrastructure has so many leaks and problems in it that we're losing a lot of water, which is a loss of energy. I don't know what the situation is in Brazil, but it's true in many other countries. Globally, water uses about 40% of all energy produced in the world, which is a significant amount. The World Bank believes that purely energy efficiency techniques, if introduced in the corporate sector by the water companies, can reduce energy use by 5, I'm sorry, it's not 2, it's, that should be 5 to 25%, if I can get this thing to work. Actually, that 2 is 25%. In the US, 39% of water is used in thermoelectric plants, which shows you the consumption of water. A lot of that water is pumped from underground resources, which consumes energy as well. Pumping water ranges from 540 to 2,200 kilowatts per million gallons, which again is a consumption of energy, which is fairly significant. And US power plants use 140 billion gallons per year, which is more than is used for all of irrigation and agriculture, and 3 times what is used by the domestic and municipal usage. So you can see the impact of consumption of water by the energy sector, at least in the US. Now, I brought this up about municipal wastewater. It is a big concern because the supply of water for power and for all of the users is a great concern because water is a declining resource, clean water is. But at least in the US, you have 1.4 trillion gallons of water produced by municipal wastewater, which tends to be neglected as a source of water. But when you start talking about water shortages, they are looking at that now as a potential source. The water problem is a geographic problem. In the Middle East, they've got a lot of energy, but they don't have much water. So they have to adopt and develop technologies that address that. Desalination is what they have chosen for the most part. And most of the desalination plants in the world are in that region, the arid zones, the desert zones. In the US, particularly in California, we have about 10 million gallons capacity of desalination. Now, the problem with desalination, as you probably know, is that it's a highly energy-intensive process. But what happens is that because of the geography of certain locations or countries or regions, they're forced to adopt energy-intensive practices to be able to get a supply of clean water, which is, again, a thing that comes up depending on whether you're Saudi Arabia or wherever. But on average, just to give you an idea of what water consumption is with energy, it's about 2 gallons of water to produce 1 kilowatt of power. So, do the arithmetic. It's significant if you look at how much power a society consumes. Okay, here's some. I'm sorry. Where am I pointing?
Try to point at the.
Oh, there.
Here.
Okay, here's some more things to think about. I'm putting up a lot of this stuff because a lot of what I'm talking about is actually work in process right now. I mean, as I said, there are groups in Colombia, there are groups elsewhere. But here are some of the things that also impact energy utilization and water utilization. Obviously, population growth, which increases the use of both. The utilities, at least in the US and probably here, tend not to be centralized, but tend to operate at the state level. And for various reasons, historically, mainly, they're given quasi-monopolies. And they're highly inefficient. They waste water, they waste energy, their distribution systems are antiquated and old, but they are able to do that because they enjoy almost a monopoly status. This is being looked at very closely these days. And because of that, they can charge what they want and they have no incentive to innovate. So you've got a system built in at the utility level for both water utilities and energy utilities, where there is no incentive to improve productivity, improve efficiency. Subsidies, again, I'm using the US example, is also sometimes the wrong approach. I guess Brazil has been very good at developing ethanol as a biofuel, using sugarcane as a feedstock. In the US, they started developing it using corn, which is wrong. Corn is a highly energy-intensive crop, not just the growing of the crop, but the fertilizers, the pesticides, everything that goes in as inputs. The thermodynamic balance of corn-based ethanol is actually negative. You get less energy out than you put in. And yet ethanol was being subsidized. There was a lot of venture capital going into ethanol plants. I used to live in the Midwest in Chicago, and I'd drive down to downstate Illinois, and there were all these ethanol plants cropping up using venture capital from the West Coast. All of that is gone. They're all shut down, because they all realize there's no way they're going to make any money there. Agriculture consumes about 80% of total water resources in most developing countries, less so in the developed countries. But that shows you that agriculture is a huge consumer of water, energy is a huge consumer of water, and agriculture is also energy intensive. So you again have a kind of a very complex situation. You need food to eat, but you use a lot of water, you use a lot of energy in the form of fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, etc. And it becomes a dilemma. But it also creates an imperative to develop practices, agricultural practices, cropping practices, technologies that can improve the efficiency of use of both water and energy in agriculture. Climate change, I mean, it's put a tremendous pressure on fossil fuel production, reduce it, conserve it, etc. I think everyone's familiar with it. But the technology challenge is how do you achieve that? And there are a number of universities, at least in the States and all over the world, that are developing technologies addressing how to deal with conservation and efficiency of fossil fuel usage. One of the things that's coming out, and this is actually very troublesome from the policy angle, is that the quality of data available on both sectors is very poor, very unreliable. This has been admitted to by the World Health Organization in the case of water, by the US Environmental Protection Agency, and several other organizations. And this becomes a major impediment because if you don't have good, accurate data, how do you create good policy, you know. It's just being recognized. As I mentioned earlier, Brazil has large energy resources and is very fortunate. I know it's causing all kinds of political, economic problems, but it's still. But you are having a serious water crisis, as I understand it. And then there are some innovations that are coming out, but for the most part, the governments are not putting enough money into the development of R&D for these kinds of innovations, including the US. There's a lot of pressure on the US government to invest more in technological innovation and improvement and the science that goes behind it that address these kinds of problems. And then there is something which is associated, which I just mentioned here, is one of the things that happens if you have bad water. Like I lived in Mexico for 3 years working on water issues. Well, bad water is bad water. And Mexican water I would not recommend to anybody. Is boil it twice, as I said, or drink the beer, you know. That it causes waterborne diseases, and that affects infant mortality, but also morbidity, and that has a direct impact on productivity in the factory and the farm. So it has a broader economic impact, and it puts a burden on the state, because the state has to, where the state has public health, it puts an economic burden on the state, because the state has to deal with this problem of these people getting sick and whatnot. Okay, basically, did I miss something? Sorry. This is a very simplified graph. Okay? There are two dynamics here in water and energy. Okay? One is the creation of energy, the production and refining of oil, the production of biofuels such as ethanol, the management and maintenance of solar panels all require water. Okay, and so you have to produce water. But to produce water requires energy. So the more water you produce, the more energy you consume. It's sort of one-to-one correlation. I don't know the exact correlation, but you are stuck with that dilemma. The society needs water for many reasons. It has to consume energy to produce it. And there's no way around it. The other thing is the opposite, is energy production causes water contamination. Oil refining produces contaminated water, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to have treatment of that water to clean it up to use. And there, you're also consuming energy. As you treat more and more contaminated water, you're consuming more and more energy. So both the contamination of water and the production of energy have kind of a contradictory impact, you know. And that's another area where technology needs to look. Okay, so coming to innovation, these are some of the priority areas that come out of this situation, which is we call it the energy water nexus. That's the term being used. It's, we need technologies to improve conservation, energy efficiency. There are institutes of energy efficiency now. I think University of California, Santa Barbara has one. There are technologies to improve the efficiency of production of oil, of energy, and of alternative sources of energy. I will skip footprint reduction, but there are technologies needed for improving the way in which you can remove contamination, and how to make the best of waste. At Columbia, we're working on a extremely powerful technology that treats wastewater, and actually, unlike other waste treatment processes which consume a lot of energy, this system consumes 60% of energy. And in addition, unlike other systems which produce a residue, we don't produce any residue, we produce a nutrient. And in addition to that, we produce biogas, which is a fuel. So even though we're using energy and less energy, we're also producing energy And this is a technology that just recently received a tremendously important award in the US. It's called the MacArthur Award. And Colombia has decided to commercialize it. Now, interestingly enough, I found out last night that there is a collaboration that's going to be announced tomorrow, Monday, between Colombia and Copy.
Yes.
Copy?
Yes,
And this technology is one of the components of that collaboration. So it's interesting to you. There is a technology needed to improve the quality of renewable energy, new sources, technologies to improve recycling of water, because that's one way you can replenish your water supply. It's not an easy, it's energy intensive, water treatment. There are also technologies, I shouldn't say technologies, they're models, organizational models related to the grids, the electric power grids, which tend to be localized, municipal level or broader. But the current ones are highly dedicated and inefficient. They're too big. And there's more and more focus looking at what they call mini grids. And most grids are for one type of power, which is electricity normally. But we do have new sources of energy like solar, wind, etc. So now they look at integrated grids where you incorporate solar power, wind power, whatever other kind of biofuel power into the grid. So your grid becomes a multi-power, multi-source system for providing power to the population. Metering, which is measuring how much people use in the use of water, in the use of fuel, is a tricky thing. Most metering is not very accurate. In some cases, there's no metering done. At Columbia, we do have some very advanced metering technologies that are actually been deployed already. But metering has an impact because it is the metering quality that impacts the revenue stream and the financial health of the sources and providers of the power and water, as well as the consumer, you know. And then we need solutions which we call scalable, because you need systems that work in a village, in a community. You need systems that work in a small town, villages, large cities. And if you have a good technology, you need a technology that can be scaled up to the demand that is required of it. You know? The next point is, again, related to policy, is that I find that most policy tends to be one-level policy. It's normally at the national level. And it neglects the fact that there are different levels at which policies need to be addressed. And at each level, the policy issues are slightly different. At the international level, of course, it's mainly agreements, there's conflicts. I mean, countries are fighting with each other over energy and water. Geography makes a difference. There are all kinds of international treaties related to both these sectors. There is the question of technology transfer, because a lot of technology is being developed in the industrialized countries. A lot of the need is in developing countries, but technology transfer is not that easy to accomplish. So, at the national level, the main focus tends to be on resource management and allocation. You know, how much money you put in this, and this. National growth, it depends a lot on the fiscal pressures that the countries are facing at that time. Like Brazil right now is going through a crisis, and I'm curious to know what impact that's going to have on the energy policy and the water policy. You know? I don't know it, unfortunately. There's a political economy, which is when you implement a policy and the policy has disproportionate benefits to one segment of society rather than the other. Like if you price too high, the poor can't afford it. Okay? If you have a large population that's outside your grid, they don't have any access to it. These are all issues in politics which policies need to address. Then you go down to the sub-regional level, or the province or the state.
7 minutes.
Yep, I got it. At that time, that's where utilities come in, and then you go down to the municipal, where issues of delivery, taxation, etc. come up. So basically, I mean, what you need is an integration between all these different policies. And there is no clear mapping. You know, the policies are like pillars, they're separate from each other, and you need to know what the interactions are between them. This is something that I think is important and is being recognized, but is not being, it still needs to be done, even in the US. I think Europe is probably further ahead. And although the ways in these problems are being driven as economics and engineering, you need to look at the social sciences because a lot of it involves non-economic, non-engineering, non-quantifiable variables. We look also at user behavior, ethnography as a technique to understand how water and energy is used right down to the household and community level. And so those things are also needed. Now, so what are the policy implications of all this? These are my last two slides, don't worry. One is you need a multi-domain approach. Having policy that stays in individual domains is just not the right way to go. Now, I know that becomes a political problem because that means you got to get a variety of ministries to talk to each other. Very often they're in conflict with each other. It's a political problem, it's a bureaucratic problem, etc. But without that multi-domain approach, you can't have an integrated policy that addresses this range of issues. There are contradictions and disconnects. What you do in energy hurts water, vice versa, and so on and so forth. We call that reciprocal vulnerability. Looking at the stakeholders, with what they want, right from the consumer to industry, to agriculture, to civil society, must be brought into the policy. One area which tends to be neglected or has been neglected is infrastructure, although you would think that infrastructure would be central to industrial policy. And that's why in the US, infrastructure in water and power is in complete disrepair, which is causing enormous waste and inefficiency. And you need policies that encourage research on new technologies, which is still too low in my opinion. That's basically the main overview. And since I've got 3 minutes, out of that, because it's EBAPE, and EBAPE is an education institute, and this is a research project, these are some of the areas where I think research would be very helpful to address the problems I just described. There needs to be a domain mapping. I mean, I can say domain, but domain means it's a complex thing. What are the organizations, what's happening, etc. There needs to be a good mapping of that. There needs to be a good analysis, socioeconomic analysis of what I call the cross externalities. You know, how one thing in one sector affects something else in the other sector, especially a negative externality. There needs to be analysis and research into what kinds of new technologies are needed to address these problems. New policy instruments, because some things cannot be achieved with current policy instruments. Pricing, for example, is an issue which has come up, at least in the US. Is the pricing model of utilities the right one? And there are people saying, no, it's not the right one because it is, it's done by consumption. So you are charged how many gallons or how many kilowatt hours. And they say, why not move to the model that the cell phone companies use? You're billed as a service. There needs to be management and organization change. There may be a need for new structures and agencies to deal with these problems. The regulatory environment that affects all these water and energy needs to be re-examined and is being re-examined right now. And all this costs money. And water in the US to repair the infrastructure is going to cost trillions of dollars, and nobody knows where that money is going to come from. And that's a big problem. And you need to, at the end of the day, look at how all this fits into the idealized model of sustainable development. Okay. So that's my proposed research agenda. And thank you. I'm, I think, 1.5 minutes over time. Sorry, yes. Monica.
That's okay. Well, thank you, Batu. So if there's anyone, some questions, please. Oh, yes, please. Do you have a microphone for her? It's coming.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh. I'm sorry, I did.
I'm speaking in English.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you mentioned instead of paying for consumption, paying for a service. In this last one, I'm sorry, you were running, and so I didn't understand that last policy recommendation.
Sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
You said, as opposed to paying for consumption, they could be billed as a service.
Yeah,
Could you elaborate on that?
Right. There was one of the organizations looking at this issue is the National Academy of Sciences. And that's one of the things that they've identified, that the traditional existing way of billing is by how much water you use, how much electricity you use. And they found that that is not really the most efficient way. It puts a burden on the utility supplying it in terms of monitoring, billing, metering, etc. And it also has sort of a behavioral impact on the consumer. And so they've proposed that just like the cell phones, in the old days, cell phones you were charged by number of minutes used. Now, in most cases, you buy a monthly plan, which is unlimited call, unlimited texting, whatever, you know. And they're proposing that the utilities move to that kind of a pricing model because it'd be more predictable and more manageable. And it may produce efficiencies. But this is under discussion. It's not, no one's doing it yet. I'm sorry? You lost it.
If for unlimited amount, people use more.
Well, the two things. One is if you're paying by amount used, there is a tendency to reduce consumption, but there's also a tendency not to care and use things. It's not so much for that. It's more for management of the supply. Because when they know that they're going to be providing so much, and they can predict their revenue, it's like a subscription. You know, it's a much more powerful financial model and revenue model than the billing in this thing. And the other thing is that consumers are happier because they know what their bill is going to be every month. You know, otherwise in the summertime it shoots up because of air conditioning, electricity shoots up. In the wintertime, your fuel oil jumps up because of cold. And a flat rate helps a domestic household to manage their own finances also. So there are all kinds of those kinds of more intangible benefits. I don't know if I answered that. It hasn't been, I mean, it's being talked about. They don't have a perfect model yet. You know, they're struggling with it.
Any other question? Yes, please, sir. Could you please bring the microphone there?
Good morning. My name is Jefferson Suarez. I work for the Investment Promotion Agency of the City of Rio de Janeiro. My question is, one of the big news of last week was Toyota, the car manufacturer from Japan, announced that in something like 30 years from now, they will stop manufacturing engines that run on fossil fuels. If this becomes an epidemic decision, it will mean a dramatic change to the oil and gas industry as it looks like today.
Yeah, I personally believe that that is the way in which transportation is going to go away from gasoline and fossil fuels. I mean, you already have electric cars on the road. You've got a lot of work being done. I think the companies like Tesla, which are already using this, you already have hybrid models, you know, they have hydrogen-powered cars. I think 30 years is too long for Toyota. I think it can be done in less time. You know, they may have their own reasons because of sunk costs and current investment in production, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But technologically, it's possible even now. It might be expensive, but those costs are going to be driven down.
Yeah.
And the other thing is at least regulation also plays a role. So when they start capping and putting limits and, not limits, requirements on gas consumption, as they did in the US, that also forces car manufacturers in that direction.
Yeah, yeah.
So yes, I'm confident in 10 years, there'll be a lot less gasoline-driven cars.
And this obviously implies in big changes in public policies regarding the oil and gas industry everywhere, right? Because I mean, fossil
well, it'll
fuels
certainly reduce demand, which is not that bad a thing because we got climate change to worry about.
Yeah.
Whether the oil companies will like it, I'm not sure. You know, it will put a pressure on the power companies, oil companies.
Absolutely, yes.
And the coal companies. No, not the coal, but the gasoline companies, sorry.
Yeah. So
how it works out, it's partly a function of how strong the lobby is in Washington and how enlightened the companies are.
Right, so this will definitely mean big changes in public policies regarding the oil and gas.
It will definitely require. Well, it's already happening. The EPA has already put out mandates on limits on gas consumption, and and not just gas consumption, but other kinds of pollution, etc. So the regulatory framework is tightening. At least in some countries.
Any other question? I have one question and one comment. Part of the conundrum of how to deal with the combination of oil and gas and waste in the sector, and how to transform it, to use it into a new industry or new goals, new products or sub-products. And you have said that there are different domains. Domains of the domains first of the food and the energy, food and water, and then the public, the central, local, or regional and local governments.
Right.
How do you think the synergy between the oil and water industry or water waste industry will work? And is of your knowledge, has been like efforts or efficient and successful efforts integrating the two and having like working in a different direction or in a new direction for a new product or new things in the area?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about making positive use of waste, not just in energy and water, but in many sectors. I'm actually working on some projects where you take the waste from agriculture production and you can produce ethanol from it. Okay, this is in Mexico. It's from the plant that they make tequila from, actually. And that's been piloted, demonstrated, it's a commercially viable thing. There is another aspect, which is that one person's waste can be another person's raw material. For example, all the waste water that comes out of municipal water can be treated and used in the energy production and refining cycle. But the economics need to be worked out. But the municipalities are treating it anyway. It's their job. They have to treat it. So it's available, but they aren't using it. I mean, it's not being used by industry, And that is something that is an enormous, I think 1.2 trillion gallons of water per year. It's municipal wastewater. So yes, the concept of using your waste as my raw material is very actively being. Actually, there is a conference in the Caribbean being organized by UNIDO and WIPO and CARICOM and several, which is on the theme of waste to energy.
Okay.
Which I'll let you know about.
Yes.
So, and even the technology that we have developed and are commercializing at Columbia, you're using waste to produce nutrients and gas. So it's another example.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. Any other question? So, do you want to? Okay. So now I introduce Renato Lima, who Charlotte has already presented. and he's going to talk about the industry, the oil and gas industry in Mexico, and some comparisons with Brazil. Renato, please.
Speaking in Portuguese or English?
English.
Shall I do it in English?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or in Portuguese?
Your choice. I've got this.
We have a majority of Brazilian speakers here, so.
Yeah, speaking of Portuguese.
I think we can do it in English, please.
Okay. Happy to do it. Is the pointer here? Okay, thank you, Monica. Thanks everyone who has come. I'm very happy to be here and talk a little bit about my research. My broader research project involves Brazil, Mexico, and Malaysia, countries that are mid-income countries, and they differ in terms of their geological endowment. So traditionally, Mexico is a country that has been well endowed with oil resource and of a very low-cost oil resource. So the geology of Mexico, particularly on the Campeche Bay area, is of carbonates with a naturally fractured reservoir. For those of you who knows that, it means that it allows to accumulate large amounts of oil that has been originated there, and also the permeability of the formations are pretty high. So you have a high porosity and high permeability. So that's great to produce oil. But this reality is changing, and Mexico now has developed much more challenging resource, and the country was unable to do it with its own current institutional framework, and it has moved. So this summer, between June to late August, I was working at the Secretariat of Energy, which is basically the Ministry of Energy of Mexico, and I participated in the discussions of these new rules, particularly regarding the industrial and technological changes. In July 15, we had a very historical moment that for the first time since 1938, when Mexico has expropriated its oil operations from foreign companies, Mexico started to have these bidding rounds for oil. And it was quite a surprise because few things are more sacred in Mexico than resource nationalism. And I don't even think that La Virgen de Guadalupe is more sacred than used to be the oil sector, because not everyone in Mexico is Catholic. So it was quite a surprise. And not only we had an opening for bidding rounds, but we also had a new regulatory institutions, the increase of taxation to the general population to compensate the declining rents that came from oil, an increase in R&D investments coming from the oil sector, among other things. Pemex Pemex is the main oil company of one of the main companies in the world, and it's the main company in Mexico. Pemex used to be run in a fiscal regime that it was akin to in a governance regime that was similar to the post office or to the Ministry of Education, and now they changed it to something called a state productive enterprise. In the government, Pemex used to do everything alone in the oil sector. The only control of the government was through the Minister of Finance, Hacienda, and it controlled the budget. So the idea was that Pemex was basically running all the oil sector alone without any real oversight. And the only control that the rest of the government had over Pemex was to allocate the budget, determine the size of the budget and which kinds of investments were allowed. And the idea, basically the government overtaxed Pemex constantly. So Pemex used to pay more than 70% of taxes. There were years that Pemex had to go to take debt in order to pay taxes. And the main rationale of this, which is very contradictory, was that the rest of the government perceived Pemex to be extremely inefficient and captured by the union of workers and some suppliers and things like that. So if I heavily tax them, they are going to have less money floating around to give as benefits. So this was a very, one can understand, but at the same time, it limits the capabilities of the company to invest in technology and invest in more exploration. So this model had to change. And we had, within this change of the oil sector in Mexico, there was a lot of intention to copy best practice in the world, and also try to avoid other problems. So my main point here in terms of theoretical analysis is to try to understand why Mexico decided to open its oil sector and why the reform took that particular shape. For example, Mexico also adopted local content legislation that is going to be at least 35% in 10 years from now. In reforms are pretty hard to pass. EPN is Enrique Peña Nieto. So you can see that some of them are even make bad mentions about the mother of the deputies who approved that. But it was passed, and one of the big reasons is that the Mexican state is really hungry for oil. So here's a curve of the Mexicans' oil production. It peaked in 2004. It increased extremely fast from late 70s to early 80s. And since 2004, Mexico is producing less and less each year. But the Mexican state is still as dependent from oil rents as it was in the 80s. So basically, the Mexican state it runs on oil revenues, and it hasn't changed over the years. About a third of the budget is still funded by profits coming from Pemex. And it was thought that this decline of production would be compensated by going to the deep offshore. But in reality, so here we have, is it the laser? No. So here we have the production of oil and gas lease in the Gulf of Mexico in the Mexican side with these blocks on purple, and the leases from the US side of the Gulf of Mexico. So each block of that orange block, is one oil platform. In the Mexican side, there is zero oil production come from deep offshore. And the answer is that basically in Mexico, there was only one oil operator, Pemex, and Pemex never developed technology for deep offshore, something that Brazil is doing since 1985. And it is still a big challenge for them. They have a lot of operations on shallow waters, really shallow waters, but they never developed this capability for deep offshore. My broader research project explained why that was the case. And if we look at the potential additional resource of Mexico, we see that they have this exploration in the deep sea, but also unconventionals. So the Burgos area over there, it's a continuation of the Eagle Ford of Texas. So most likely, these are areas which we know that shale oil and gas is possible, but technology is just not available for Pemex, and Pemex has very high inflated costs, and it will not be able to develop, at least without a pretty dramatic change of its governance. So Mexico shares many of the characteristics associated with petrostates that we know from the broad resource course literature. It is attempted to change by implementing 3 constitutional changes, 21 laws and 26 regulations. And theoretically, I'm going to argue that these changes are not driven by exogenous shock. There was no regime change, no war, no foreign occupation, not even the rise of a new political force. It actually was the return of PRI, which is pretty linked to the entrenched interests of the Mexican state. So what can explain this change? I would say that it's a result of an exhaustion of a model, which I defined the rent capture model and its institutions, which they were unable to provide the necessary investments in the long-term sustainability of this oil sector to go to frontier geological areas. After smaller attempts of reform, so the president, Felipe Calderón, he attempted to do a small reform, but do not touch any of the constitutional change. It became very clear that something deeper was needed to go to this frontier area, needed to develop the technology necessary for it. And this change also had pretty big distributive implications. Within Pemex, within the suppliers of Mexico, because Mexico, it's pretty surprising that Mexico had a huge Mexican company as Pemex, but it was not almost never buying goods and services from Mexican providers. It's a very minute participation of Mexican providers in the oil sector. And with the opportunity to create new laws about it, sectors of society attempt to shape procurement practices of the Pemex and also other companies who are coming, and then they had put it local content into the legislation. So this also has a pretty big future distributive implications. I will quickly skim it around just to say that a theory that I developed is from rent maximization to rent creation. So within the resource curse literature, one key aspect of the curse, the so-called curse, is how rents accrue to governments. The idea is that oil is a commodity that accrues a lot of rents, a lot of money, much below its cost of production. The cost of production is much below the amount that you can receive it in the market. And this money normally goes to governments. If governments are not constrained by institutions like checks and balances, then you have all the maladies associated with resource curse. So it's commonly said that, no, look at Norway. Norway has great institutions, so it's not cursed by oil revenues because it allocates in a sovereign fund that is going to invest in the years to come. I actually reinterpret the Norwegian case not only as a case of good institutions, but also a country that had a challenging geology. The North Sea at the time was pretty challenging to develop and had good policies to tie this type of technological challenge to the development of local suppliers. So it's not only about institutions, but also the type of geology you have. So rents, normally analyzing rents, we have the scarcity, differential, and monopoly rents. And the oil is a type of a commodity that commands a lot of scarcity rents. It's rare. Whoever can find it normally gets rich. But also you have differential rents, which is the difference between a producer with a lower cost of production versus a different producer with some higher cost of production. So for example, if you produce oil from the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, which is the most prolific oil field in the world, it was discovered in 1948, still producing since 1951. It alone has produced 8% of all the oil in the world. It has a very low cost of production. If you compare that to the production of the pre-salt in Brazil, or even to the offshore Campos Basin on Brazil, it means that producing from Ghawar gives you a lot of more money than producing from the pre-salt. And the difference is because it just costs more to produce here. It's still profitable because of the scarcity rent, but you are not getting all this differential rent. And a third type of rent is the monopoly rent, which is the ability to restrict output to increase the price. Very few countries can do it. Can do that. OPEC is an attempt to do that at some points in the market. Not right now, but monopoly rents, you have to cut back production. If you have a small production, or if you have a marginal production in the world, you are not going to accrue monopoly rent. But there is basically the resource curse is going to center on these issues of rent capture. How do you accrue more rent to the government? How do you manage the revenues after you have them? How do you put together a national oil company to do the extraction? But I'm going to propose that there is a different type of rent, which is actually much more important for development, which are the Schumpeterian rents, the rents from innovation. And to think about Schumpeter and his view of what is the role of the entrepreneur is to reform or revolutionize the pattern of production by exploiting an invention, or more generally, an untried technological possibility for producing a new commodity or producing an old one in a new way. So if you are able to produce an old commodity, like a barrel of oil, in a new way by exploiting a different type of geological formation or applying a different type of combination of technology, then you are performing what Schumpeter said is the function of the entrepreneur, And one interesting current dynamic in the market is that we are seeing exactly that, the growth of production of oil from once unthinkable geologies, things that we know that they were there, that they had hydrocarbons trapped, but it was just not economical or technological to produce them. And when you have countries that are basically going for these routes or firms, they are accruing Schumpeterian rents. And these Schumpeterian rents, they have a whole range of spillovers. They're not just giving money to governments in the sense of owners of the resource, but actually providing a lot of money to the providers of technology. So in this way, there is this change from rent capture to rent creation. The idea that when you have to confront challenging geology, you actually have to create an institutional framework that will support rent creation, which means to invest in R&D, to invest in new technological solutions through close contact with suppliers, just because the era of easy oil is vanishing. So you have to invest into developing this different resource. So that is exactly the shape of these institutions are that reduce investment risk, costs, and facilitate technological development. And this analysis becomes more important because the era of easy oil is going. Just to show how this is a true reality, so this is from a recent medium-term world oil report from IEA, and we can see how oil can be produced from a variety of price from different projects. So here we have on the deep water from West Africa. It's going to a capex of $60 to $75 per barrel and a much higher OPEX, so 18 to 25. But if you go to Saudi Arabia, the onshore generic expansion, and that is named in this way because you have these fields, they are mapped, there's no exploratory risk, you just need to add a production from one part of the field. So it's pretty cheap, and the operating costs are pretty low. So Saudi Arabia is going to accrue all these rents, but others, producers, they will have a much higher incentive to invest in technological gains to reduce these costs. And a lot of the times, these technologies, they can also be applied to other sectors of society. And one of the, so this is also part of my broader research project, one of the consequences of developing this more high cost resource is that when you have a barrel of oil that is produced in 90% of the cost of production, it is going to be on capex. So say that your barrel of oil costs $50, but in order to produce it, it's going to cost $40 on capital investment. You have $10 of rents. This $10 per barrel is still a lot of money, but you have $40 of demand on industrial goods. So there is a pretty good logic here why you might, rather than just fighting for the rents on after the oil is sold, we're actually fighting to be included in the production chain, to have some part of the contracts of this $40 demand that exists. So that's how my explanation for the growth of local content across the world in places like Nigeria, in places like Brazil, and in places like Mexico right now. So when you have to buy much more oil platforms, where these oil platforms are going to be built becomes a political decision. So I'm going to talk a little bit now more historically on Mexico. I don't know how much time I have. So Mexico is it's a fascinating story on oil production. Because I mentioned the geology of Mexico, the yacimientos naturalmente fracturados, which means that they produce a lot of oil with very low costs. So back in the late 70s, they found this huge reservoir in the Campeche Bay area. And the then president, Jose Lopez Portillo, in Mexico, you have a 6-year term that you cannot be renewed. There is no re-election. It's called the sexenio. And Lopez Portillo, he found this oil and said, okay, so what we are going to do with all this oil? Let's develop it. And the Jorge Diaz Serrano was the head of Pemex at the time. He commissioned a company, Brown and Root, to do the whole project. So it could come online very, very fast. And it was done, it was a typical enclave development, produce it from abroad. And this fast-track development was extremely costly. But at that time, with the OPEC oil shock and later with the Iranian revolution, anything could go. The price was high. Brian Root was doing all the work from abroad. It asked for much more money every time, and Pemex said, fine, fine, as long as you deliver it. And one of the problems was a major environmental disaster in a well called Itzok, that for 10 months was spilling 40,000 barrels of oil per day. So it was a huge cost in environmental terms as well. But for the country, it was able to quickly bring into production these reserves. In Lopez Portillo, after he commissioned the start of it, he said, well, you know, that Mexico, this country full of contrasts, ha estado acostumbrado a administrar carencias y crisis. Ahora con el petróleo, el otro extremo, tenemos que acostumbrarnos a administrar la abundancia. So management of abundance, it really reminds me of a recent Brazilian president on pre-salt. And the idea that, hey, we found this ticket, we are going to have all this money, and we now need to manage the abundance. But it was a big failure to Mexico. And because one of the big reasons was that just after they start the production of oil, with a lot of debt, so it costed a lot. They basically went to the international markets. Then we have a reversion of the policy of the U.S. Central Bank with the increase of interest rates in the 80s. So the cost of the debt became much higher. With, I believe, was it Paul Volcker, the then president of the Fed. So Paul Volcker increased the interest rates. The cost of debt across the world increased a lot. At the time that the production of oil was booming, and the price of oil goes down. So the projected revenue goes down, the cost of debt goes up, and the country then enters into a huge crisis. Mexico was the first country in Latin America to default in its debt in the 80s. Just like 5 years after now we have to manage the abundance. We are rich. So we can explain the growth of production of Mexico almost by a single field. It is like getting just one block and say that, okay, so that's the production of the country, which is Cantarell. The story goes that Cantarell was discovered by a fisherman who was fishing in the Campeche Bay area, and he had all these stains of oil in his fishing nets, and then he went to complain to Pemex. Hey guys, your operation here is damaging my fish boat and my operations. And said, no, we are not, we have no operations there. And then somebody, yeah, let's look at it. And so they started to drill there, and they found this huge reservoir. There are some people who contest that version, but the main point of the story is that it was so easy to find it, extremely easy. And Cantarell is a supergiant field. It's one of the supergiant fields in the world. So here you can see data that I collected on the different type of where the Mexican oil comes from. So Cantarell and later Kumalop-Sap, which are also 3 different fields, but also considered to be like a giant field. They are responsible for the bulk of oil production in Mexico. And then after 2004, Cantarell starts to decline. The Pemex says that, no, we are going to produce from Región Norte, from an area called Chicontepec, which is a pretty hard to produce area, much more close to unconventional production. And so here's more on the technology and development of it. Just to say that Pemex never had a sustained program to develop technology for the oil sector. It was so easy to produce that they could buy everything from abroad. They didn't have to develop suppliers, and also because they really wanted to produce it as fast as possible. And the idea that you would have to develop suppliers, First, it wasn't a need from technological terms, and also it wasn't politically necessary, because if the production would take longer to come online, then another president would benefit from it. Remember, it's a 6-year term, and each president tries to do a very different type of government. But Mexico has one Versempis, which is the Mexican Institute of Oil, EMP. And EMP is responsible for doing R&D in the oil sector, was responsible for certifying suppliers, but EMP, everyone says that it only worked in the first 10 years. Later, it became just a service provider of very low technological content services. And one of the things that I did to test this hypothesis, that EMP with time became less and less doing research and doing more services, was to analyze the payroll of EMP. How many people were working at each year, and what is their qualifications? So here's some data on annual reports for EMP that I had to collect manually, going to the library at the basement and reading old documents, because people just don't have this information collected. So here we see per each year the number of employees. It goes up to 8,000 employees. So if I get the number from the 90s, there were 8,000 employees, and only 46 of them were PhDs. So no research institution are going to do research, real research, with such a minute number of PhDs and masters. But there were more drivers in the payroll than doctors, than researchers. So it basically was an institution that was not doing R&D. Another way of seeing that as an outcome is the number of patents. So Petrobras, for example, has more patents than Statoil, directly linked to patents registered by Statoil. But both Petrobras and Statoil had to produce under more challenging conditions. They had to invest more in technology for offshore oil. And that is a good explanation of why Petrobras and Statoil has much more patents. So here I selected only national oil companies. It's on the European Office of Patents, which are normally also filed in the United States. So Petrobras has a little bit more field only in Brazil, but normally as a policy it fields internationally. I also, for Pemex, has about a third of the patents of Petrobras, but Pemex has produced much more oil, and it's much older than Petrobras, for example, or Statoil. So that's one outcome. So by the 90s and early 2000s, the economy and politics of Mexico changed. You had democratization and economic opening, but the oil sector was the same. So the institutional framework of the oil sector was the same as the of the 30s. And after the peak, Pemex started to invest in drilling for new fields, including the Chicontepec and deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But these efforts were a failure because capabilities requires time, and also the institutional framework, in order to develop deep offshore, it's not compatible with this single monopoly position that exists there. So Pemex started to drill in order to increase reserves, but it was very weak doing that. So here we have a graph on the reserve replacement rate of proved reserves. So in 2004, of all its production, it could only add about 20% of what it was producing the year. So only during 2 years, 2012 and 2013, Pemex was barely replacing as a proved reserve what it was producing. So Pemex was depleting from its current reserves. And taking this long view from 2003 to 2015, we have this reality that in 2003, Pemex had 20 billion barrels of proved reserves. In 2015, only 13 billion barrels. So when Enrique Peña Nieto took office in December 1st, 2012, the production of reserve, the reserves could only last for more 10 years. And it's a 6-year term. So he had a huge problem in his hands. And it's not a lack of investment. So Pemex increased the investments in exploration a little bit, but much more production. So when you invest in production, in the development phase of it, it's because there's no geological and exploratory risk. In the incentives that exist, we're all to invest in short-term investments, such as production. In here, taking a very more long-term view, since the 30s of Pemex, in blue, we have the average production per well, and in red, we have the total number of wells drilled at each year. So before the 70s, whenever Pemex wanted to increase the production of oil, it had to drill more wells because the average production per well was more or less the same, about 200 barrels of oil per day. But with the discovery of Cantarell in the Campeche Bay, Pemex stopped drilling. There's no need more to drill. We have all this huge reservoir here. And the efficiency, the production per well increased a lot. And when it starts to drill again, because the reservoirs are depleting, they can't compensate this fall. So they start to drill a lot, but the production per well goes down up to what is back in the 74, for example. So right now, Pemex is producing from 2.3 million of barrels per year in more than double the number of wells available. And why is that the case? Because when Pemex wanted to go for deep water, it's a very costly development, and competitors, they tend to share risks. They join consortiums. Shell with Exxon, for example. Petrobras with Galp and BG. So each one pool their money, in addition to expertise, to try to develop this one deep water block, for example. Pemex did one exploratory well in one area of the deep water, and it had to incur all the costs, and it lost $150 million alone. It couldn't share risks. And another important thing is that these new areas, they generate a much lower return of barrel producing. So it has a higher cost. But the fiscal regime of Pemex was constructed in a way that if Pemex increased the production from this higher cost area, it was actually losing money. And I will show that. Another problem was this historical strategy of buying technology rather than developing. It was R2D Little made one report for them recommending Pemex to be a strong follower, to not develop technology. It was not in their best interest, just buy technology. And all the three possible future routes of increasing production of Mexico, be the enhanced oil recovery, EOR, or going for deep waters or unconventional, all of these are technology and cost intensive and incompatible with the old institutions. So here are the reserves of Mexico. We can see that we have a lot of prospective reserves into deep waters and unconventionals, but they are still on the prospective. They're not even on the 1P, 2P, or 3P. So this is one internal document from Pemex. The 650 figure there, the cost cap, is how much Pemex was able to recover as cost. So if a barrel has up to $6.50, this will be cost. I'm not going to be taxed on income on that. I'm just recognizing costs. And below that line on 650, you see each one of the producing regions. The cost of Kumalop-Sap, the cost of Cantarell, the cost of Burgos, and the cost of ATG, which is Aceite Terciario del Golfo, and Costa Rica. So everything that Pemex produced above the $650 mark, it was losing money. It was paying to produce. So it was good for the government, but bad for Pemex as a company. But it was impossible for Pemex to say, stop producing at that level. And here's some of this data, more updated. The cost of barrel is now up to $28 there. So it had to change this fiscal regime because production from high-cost resource cannot be taxed at the level of low-cost oil. It has to be adjusted accordingly. And this high-cost production, because you need to buy more capital goods and all that, also increased the pressure for local suppliers to be included into the supply chain. So during the congressional debates, you had this pressure to include local content legislation. And it was put 25 now and up to 35 in 2025. And the increase the investment of Pemex in exploration and its efficiency becomes a paramount issue. So one of the big changes within Pemex was the removal of the union from the board of Pemex. So it used to be the case that Pemex, before 2008 reform, Pemex used to have 6 representatives from the government and 5 from the union. So nothing was passed if the union didn't want. They could just walk away from the meetings and then you would have no decision. In 2008, Felipe Calderon, he approved a reform by trying to dilute the power of the unions by adding 4 independent members. But these 4 members were actually not independent. Each one was linked to the parties. They had to be approved by the Senate, and then the PAN had 2 members, the PRI one and the PRD another one. And they were not actually looking for what was the best interest of the company, but just what was the best interest of each party. It didn't work. And I talked to one senator, he said, yeah, we recognize that didn't work, so we struck a deal. The new independent members, they have to be truly independent. Otherwise, we are not going to vote for any member that we know are tied to one of the parties. So the board of Pemex is made out of 5 members of the government and 4 independent. And to sum up, we have a major institutional change due to clear geological constraints that lead to new policies. Role for the state as a regulator and facilitator of business and industrial policy, and distributive implications, which are the rent reduction and increasing local sourcing. So it's a fascinating story on when a country stops being on the easy side of the geology, goes to this more challenging, and adapts its institutions accordingly. But there are a lot of things that are still being debated. The bidding rounds are still in its infancy, and there are some changes. But the driving force, I hypothesize that were the change of geology, putting new constraints into the government. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. Well, I have time for a few questions, and so I open the audience. Yes, there is a question there. Who has the microphone, please?
Eu vou falar em português, porque vou fazer pergunta para o Renato. Poderíamos falar em inglês, mas não há necessidade.
Não, sem problema.
Okay. Não, com relação à Pemex, eu estava ouvindo você falar e eu trabalhei durante 33 anos no SEMPES, na Petrobras, até me aposentar. E estava vendo as correlações, né, que a gente pode fazer, o mesmo tipo de país, é o mesmo tipo de instituição, é muito parecido tudo, né? Mas, na verdade, é só um detalhe técnico, é o seguinte, uma das coisas boas que a Petrobras tem é que ela é uma companhia integrada, né? Ou seja, ela tanto produz quanto refina. A grande vantagem que tem é que, e isso foi um esforço feito na década de 80 e 90 para adaptar o nosso parque de refino para a produção do marlim, né? Que o marlim é o pior petróleo do mundo, mas para nós é o melhor, porque é o único que a gente tem, né? Agora teremos outros, né? Talvez. Mas o fato é o seguinte, então isso te permite ficar um pouquinho independente do preço do petróleo, porque você não é só um vendedor de petróleo cru, você também é um refinador. E a pergunta que eu vou te fazer é essa, porque eu não tenho esse dado com relação à Pemex. A Pemex tem um parque de refino grande, porque algumas daquelas patentes ali, quando você falou em patentes, eu me lembrei da minha vida no SEMPES. Né? E exatamente, boa parte das patentes da Petrobras são na área de refino. E também a parte de conteúdo local e desenvolvimento industrial se refere muito à parte de refino. Então, eu não sei se você tem esse dado, mas como você vivenciou mais, como é que é essa relação lá em termos da Pemex? Ou seja, eles estão focados apenas na parte de produção de petróleo ou existe um esforço parecido na área de refino? Não sei nem se você tem esse dado.
Eu tenho, e
então,
posso
ótimo.
responder.
Obrigado. E antes de mais nada, meus cumprimentos pela apresentação, pelo seu your English, sua espanhol, muito bueno. Gostei muito da forma que você colocou.
Muito obrigado. Não, essa pergunta é extremamente interessante. A Pemex tem um parque de refino construído ao longo dos anos, e a última grande refinaria foi em 79, depois teve muitas adaptações, e o que acontece é que, na verdade, o petróleo típico, o chamado Maya Crude, ele é mais pesado do que o brasileiro. Você tem um petróleo mexicano, ele tem um alto conteúdo de enxofre, e ele é mais pesado, e o que acontece é que a maior parte das reservas onshore são de petróleos mais leves, mas a grande produção de Cantarell é mais pesado. Então, o parque de refino fazia a mesma coisa que o Brasil, então tinha esse problema de fazer um blend, e a maior parte das patentes do IMP é ligado ao downstream, é ligado à distribuição, é ligado à química de processos de refino. Se você conversa com o pessoal do downstream lá, eles acham que fizeram grandes coisas, porque também o IMP já fez projetos de refinarias, as refinarias todas eram feitas pelo IMP. O que aconteceu, é muito interessante uma parte, é que as refinarias comandadas pela Pemex são extremamente ineficientes. Extremamente ineficiente. O pessoal lá jogando dominó, o sindicato controla todos os contratos. Você ser fornecedor da Pemex, você tem que ter autorização do sindicato. Isso até poucos anos atrás. E o sindicato tinha empresas fornecedoras. Era a empresa do sindicato, e dizia, fazer isso aqui vai ser o sindicato. Então, tudo isso aumentava o custo gigantemente. Inclusive, eu conversei com vários CEOs da Pemex ou pessoas ligadas à administração, e mesmo funcionários. Uma coisa que eles concordam é que se você tirasse 40% do pessoal da Pemex, não faria diferença alguma na operação. Você tem um 40% de overhead de pessoal lá. E aí, na questão das refinarias, o custo era gigante. E aí o governo fez isso já no começo dos anos 2000, o governo fez o seguinte, então a gente tem um problema que é um sistema monopolista, fechado, que não está aberto a pressões competitivas e nem a práticas internacionais. Eles fizeram uma associação com a Shell, no Texas, na refinaria de Deer Park. Então, o cru mexicano vai para refinarias de óleo pesado no Texas, processa lá e volta como produtos para o México, porque isso ficou mais barato do que fazer no México, dado os custos elevados de gestão. O problema é que a ideia era que isso servisse também como exposição a práticas e tecnologia. O problema é que isso nunca foi para frente, em que eles só fizeram essa estratégia comercial, mas nunca tiveram a estratégia de aprendizagem.
I have two questions, one from me and one from Smita, who's following you still from India. So I will start with mine. So your hypothesis is that the geology forced the Mexican government to renew their public policy with regard to oil and gas. But then we see again that this another state, just as Brazil, betting very heavily on oil and gas as its main income, as a very important industry. So it's a bit in line with what I asked yesterday. What's your opinion, like how is Mexico dealing with renewables? Because as Atul also said, Toyota is planning to shut down its gasoline engines. So why does Mexico also bet so heavily on this oil and gas as a main source of revenue? That's my question. And then we have Smita, if my phone, wait. She wants to know, first of all, congratulations for your presentation. So she wants to know, like, how did shifts in procurement and local content policies get converted into local revenue sharing and subnational benefits? Were new center-state political arrangements required, and who pushed these development outcomes locally?
Can I show something?
Yes.
Is it possible to put my...
Point there.
Pode voltar a apresentação?
Slides, por favor. Okay.
So I had one extra slide about the local content formula of, so I will reply to the last question first. So right now, so basically Pemex procures from outside of Mexico, from foreign companies, most of them based in Houston, in the US. And during the debates about the local content legislation of Mexico, the position of Pemex was to be totally against it. They said, okay, no, zero local content. You guys want me to be the provider of money for the whole Mexican state, and now you want me to do industrial policy as well? No, we are not going to accept that. But during the debates in the Congress, it was forced. And one of the rationale was that the foreign companies, and here's my barrel of oil from Exxon, foreign companies are going to come to Mexico with their own network of suppliers. So we already lost an opportunity of having Pemex as developer suppliers here. And now if all foreign companies are going to come with their own network of suppliers, we are also going to lose this opportunity. So even the small amount of domestic suppliers are not going to have an opportunity. So the Mexican state, which is a pretty anti-industrial policy state, had to maneuver ways to accommodate this pressure for inclusion of domestic suppliers with their own need for fiscal resource, which means to minimize the cost of production as possible in their international trade agreements. Mexico is a country that is involved in a lot of international trade agreements, including NAFTA. And what they did was to create a formula that would be neutral. In terms of it's not mandating you to buy from a domestic company. It's mandating you to buy from 6 different variables up to the point that it's going to be 35% at least of the total expenditure in a project. So you can buy on either on goods, on services, on labor, on training of this labor, on technology transfer, or local infrastructure. How companies are going to allocate into these different variables, it's still a point of discussion. Obviously, most of the expenditures of a deep offshore project, for example, is going to be on the drilling and on the production platform. So it's going to be a lot on goods and services. But if the company wants to allocate on training, on like scholarships for workers, or on technology transfer, and it's now the EMP, used to had a total tie with Pemex, is now an independent agency of the state, it can. So it's neutral in this sense. It's totally different from the local content of Brazil. And the idea here is that you can allocate on these different variables, including infrastructure. So when I was there, Exxon, I think, yeah, it was Exxon, requested information for the Ministry of Energy that they wanted to create a museum of oil, of the oil history of Mexico. And they asked, will that fit the local content legislation? Well, they checked all these things. Yeah, it can fit on infrastructure. Infrastructure means that any infrastructure of production nearby, facilities, hospitals, roads of access, things like that. So it's a very broad kind of an umbrella legislation that will, it kind of pleases operators in this sense, because the highest opposition to local content came from Pemex. So in your first question was about the fiscal, Charlotte, can you say it again?
Instead of like reorienting its policies, no, it made the choice to stay dependent on oil and gas, because you said like they had 80% dependence.
30% of the budget comes from oil and gas.
Instead of like, oh, let's go renewables or something else, no, we have to have this oil in this geology, more difficult areas. Right. So I was wondering, like, the same as Brazil, why do they still go after oil and gas? Why do they bet so heavily on oil and gas? No, knowing, as Atul said, that the end is near.
So let me qualify that. So I wouldn't say that it forced it, but it provided a huge incentive. because ultimately laws have to be voted and debated in Congresses. And in democracies, this is a messy process of a lot of compromise. So the Mexican government, for example, didn't want a local content law. It had the position of Pemex, but it was forced to accept that. The PRI government didn't want to get rid of the union of Pemex, but the PAN forced it. The PAN said that, well, if the unions are there, we are not going to vote for the change, and it was a constitutional change, 2/3 majority and approval in more than 50% of the states. So there are a lot of compromise there. But the reality is that they had to put different institutions in order to keep continuing production. They also signaled decrease of the oil rent to the state. So there is a cap that the very idea is that the oil is going to fund 4.7% of the GDP of the country as taxes. Anything that beyond that will go to a sovereign fund. And this amount will decrease up to 2035. So the idea is that slowly there will be a decrease on the amount of money that goes to government. This is a pretty significant change. But why don't they do it fast? A good reason. To replace that, it means increasing taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes. There is oil money floating around, so it was easy to fund the state through oil revenues. But also, once oil revenues are not there, then it becomes a very politically difficult time. And the government actually increased the taxes, increased it by 2.5% of GDP. This is huge. The average tax rate of Mexico is 10%. They are 10% of the GDP. They are increasing to 12.5%. And it was not easy to vote that. PAN, for example, was against. PAN is a more business-friendly party. So it's costly to do a transition. The third reason I would say is that one, I think the transition to a non-fossil fuel economy is going to take much longer than 10 years. There are a lot of reasons why oil is a very flexible, and it has a high density of energy. It has a lot of qualities that makes it a very unique good in terms of its energy characteristics. So one, I would say it will take more time. And second, renewable energy is not a good investment in the sense that it has a huge rents to be made. No, it's extremely competitive. Most of renewable energies, they are now being subsidized. So countries are losing money in order to decrease the costs of renewables. A position to be taken is that, no, they're not losing money. They are recognize the externalities that come from this other source of energy, like oil. Produce a lot of carbon. This carbon is not taxed. So the fact that we are producing with renewables and putting money to it is that we are recognize the externalities that are not existent into oil. That's a very interesting debate, but the reality from the fiscal position is that renewables means less money in the government treasury, and oil means more money. So that's why it's such a problem, and it's so difficult to perform this transition.
I think we have time for one last question, or a set of questions, but it will be
Renato,
fast,
gostei muito da apresentação. Você mencionou logo no começo que eu acredito você está usando a literatura da maldição de recursos, aquela coisa toda, e pelo que eu entendi da tua apresentação, ela não altera fundamentalmente o argumento básico, tá, que no final das contas, em função da abundância de recursos naquele determinado momento, não foram feitos os investimentos até que se chegou numa situação em que não é mais possível explorar o petróleo da maneira como era feito, e a partir de agora é necessária aquela tecnologia, aquela inovação que em outros locais, como por exemplo aqui no Brasil, demandou isso lá naquele momento. Tá? Então, em função dessa situação toda, hoje a gente está numa posição melhor em termos de inovação e somos capazes de explorar, então, você estava falando das rendas schumpeterianas a partir disso. Tá? Eu queria saber se você consegue explorar um pouquinho melhor essas questões, como é que você está trabalhando na tua pesquisa. Obrigado.
Então, o que acontece é o seguinte, a maldição de recursos naturais é altamente influenciada por uma visão de que a indústria extrativa é uma indústria típica de desenvolvimento, enclave development. É uma indústria que é separada do resto da economia, que não faz os backwards and forward linkages, que tem baixo custo de produção, mas gera enormes rendas. Também teria muito pouca demanda por inovação, por demanda industrial, por recursos humanos qualificados. Não, os recursos humanos poderiam vir todos de fora, como expats, e aí aquela parte da economia gera essa renda, e essa renda não se comunica com o resto da economia. Mas ela gera muitos recursos fiscais vão para governos. Se os governos não estão constrangidos por boas instituições, checks and balances, então esse dinheiro vai para o ruler, o cara que está lá no governo, ele com todo esse dinheiro, ele pode reprimir a oposição, pode cooptar aliados, pode fazer guerra, pode fazer tudo isso. Então, essa é a visão tradicional. Um erro dessa visão tradicional, que eu considero, é não olhar o erro de assumptions na parte industrial. Você pode ter... Tudo isso é verdade, né? Eu acho que tudo isso se aplica para uma parte do mundo, e, na verdade, em sua maior parte do mundo. Se você tem o acesso a uma geologia muito fácil, uma geologia de baixo custo de produção, tudo isso é verdade. Mas se você tem uma geologia muito mais desafiadora, o que você tem que fazer é, primeiro, mesmo que você importe toda a tecnologia, o tamanho dos seus rents vão ser menor, porque você tem um custo de produção mais elevado e você tem que vender ao preço internacional. Então, o impacto negativo daquilo, no sentido de rents que vão para governos que não são constrangidos, vão ser menor. Então, você pode ter uma produção que no volume de barris vai ser igual a outro país, mas como você tem um custo maior, você vai ter menos rents. E menos rents atrapalhando governos. O segundo ponto é que, se você tem um custo maior de produção, você tem uma demanda maior por serviços internos. Há vários serviços desses que, mesmo com baixa capacitação, você consegue fazer. Então, eu estava conversando um dia desse com um gerente da Total da Angola, perguntando sobre os serviços de estaleiro lá. Então, você estava falando, todos os serviços são feitos nos estaleiros angolanos também por conteúdo local. Então, os serviços de solda, serviços de montagem, alguns serviços simples de módulos, são feitos lá. Esse serviço existe porque é petróleo offshore. No petróleo tradicional onshore de um pumping jack, você importa a máquina, instala e fica ali parado, praticamente sem ninguém. Então, industrialmente, está tendo uma mudança de como você produz esse petróleo. Da mesma forma, uma operação de fracking nos Estados Unidos, você tem uns 100 caminhões estacionados, jogando com força água para poder fraturar as coisas. Você está falando pelo menos 100 drivers que foram até ali, fornecedores de água. Tem uma cadeia produtiva gigante. Isso não está analisado na literatura de maldição de recursos naturais, até a publicação de toda a minha pesquisa, pelo menos. e essa é a contribuição que eu tento fazer. Olhar como as características da indústria que mudaram, muda também as políticas públicas.
Ok. Na verdade, a gente está com uma questão de tempo, a gente tem que encerrar agora, mas o que eu ia pedir a todos, eu acho que vocês vão estar aqui na parte da tarde, a gente vai recolher as perguntas e passar para o Renato e fazer um fórum no site da própria plataforma. Então, se você não se importa, Renato, para você responder as perguntas, e inclusive compartilhar com todos que estão aqui, porque eu mesmo tenho várias perguntas para você. Então, infelizmente, a gente não consegue continuar, senão a gente vai atrasar muito na parte da tarde também. E eu agradeço a todos a presença e espero e conto com vocês daqui a uma hora e meia, nós retornamos com a Consuelo Diegues, que é uma jornalista da revista Piauí, que trabalha com a questão tem feito reportagens nos últimos 5 ou 10 anos sobre a Petrobras. Obrigada.
Obrigado. Good. Muito bom, muito bom. Vou tirar as perguntas para você. Vamos, conversa aí. Thank you. Very nice as well, your presentation.
Está marcando as duas?